There is a place in Canada that most people have never heard of. Not because it is remote, although it is. Not because it is difficult to reach, although the roads there are thin and unpaved and the land rises steeply toward rock faces that have not changed in 10,000 years. It is a place most people have never heard of because the people who should be talking about it have chosen, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, to say very little. And what they do say tends to be measured, cautious, wrapped in the careful language of institutions that do not like the wrong, so the place sits there. In the high wilderness of Ontario, in Quebec, along the Pacific slopes of British Columbia, in the frost-cracked barrens of Labrador, stones that someone arranged, stones that someone shaped and lifted and set into patterns that do not occur in nature, wait in the cold and the silence for someone to finally ask the right question. That question is not simply who put them there. That question is almost too small for what is actually being asked. The real question, the one that hums underneath all the careful academic papers and the suppressed survey reports and the oral traditions of people who have been saying this for generations, is this. What does it mean for everything we believe about this continent if those stones were placed there, not hundreds of years ago, but thousands? What does it mean if the people who shaped them had not wandered into an empty land, but had in fact built something, had organized themselves into communities sophisticated enough to move multi-ton blocks across terrain that would challenge a modern construction crew, had aligned those blocks to the stars, to the solstices, to magnetic north, with a precision that should not have been possible if what we learned in school was accurate? What does it mean for the story of Canada? What does it mean for the story of North America? What does it mean for the story of what human beings are and what we are capable of and how long we have been doing it? That is the question this video is going to sit with, not rush through, not answer with a tidy conclusion at the end. Just sit with, the way you sit with something that genuinely unsettles you and does not let you look away. You are probably warm right now. Maybe you have already turned the lights down. Maybe someone else in the room is already breathing slowly, already most of the way to sleep. That is fine. Let this be the sound underneath your sleep. Let these words move through you without demanding that you hold on to any of them. I am going to tell you about stones, and about time, and about a version of Canadian history that the official record has not yet found a way to fully absorb. And I am going to do it slowly, because this kind of story deserves to be told slowly. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now, and what time is it. The story begins, as most true stories do, not with a discovery, but with someone paying attention. In the summer of 1971, a geologist named Harold Doreen was conducting a routine mineral survey in the Temagami region of northern Ontario. He was not looking for anything unusual. He was not the kind of man who believed in unusual things. He had spent 20 years walking the Canadian Shield, that vast ancient slab of Precambrian rock that forms the geological heart of Canada, and he had become expert at reading it. He knew what glacial striations looked like. He knew what frost heaving did to rock over centuries. He knew the particular way that water worked its way into cracks and expanded in winter and split granite apart in patterns that, from a distance, could look almost deliberate but were only physics. He knew all of that, which is why what he found in the second week of July stopped him in a way that nothing had stopped him before. He had climbed a ridge northeast of Lady Evelyn Lake, following a magnetometer reading that suggested something interesting beneath the surface. The ridge was steep and exposed, the kind of place where the wind came through hard even in summer. When he reached the top, he expected to find the usual jumbled arrangement of rock and lichen and stunted black spruce that characterized the area. Instead, he found a row of stones. Not a natural formation. He was certain of that immediately. The stones were granite, local granite, nothing exotic, but they had been worked. Their faces were flattened in a way that weathering alone does not produce. They were set in a line running almost exactly north to south, which is not the direction that glacier movement or frost action or any other natural process would have arranged them. There were 11 of them, the tallest standing nearly 1.5 meters above the surrounding surface, the smallest just under 1 meter. They were spaced at intervals that Doreen later described in his field notes as disturbingly regular. He measured the intervals. He did it 3 times because he did not trust his first measurement. The spacing between each stone was 1.7 meters, give or take a centimeter. 11 stones, 10 intervals. Every single one within a centimeter of the same measurement. Doreen was a geologist. He was not an archaeologist. He knew enough to know that this was outside his area of expertise, and possibly outside the area of expertise of anyone he was likely to know personally. He took photographs. He recorded the coordinates. He noted the measurements in his field journal with a small asterisk and the word anomalous written beside it. Then he finished his mineral survey and went home and wrote his report and included a brief appendix describing what he had found and suggesting that someone with the appropriate expertise might want to take a look. The report went to the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. The appendix was read by at least 3 people, all of whom later confirmed having seen it. And then, in the way that inconvenient things sometimes disappear, not through any conspiracy, but simply through institutional indifference, the appendix was not forwarded to any archaeological body. It was not followed up. The coordinates sat in a filing cabinet in a government building in Sudbury for 14 years before anyone thought to do anything with them. 14 years is a long time. It is long enough for a geologist to retire, which Doreen did in 1983. It is long enough for a filing cabinet to be moved twice and for the folder containing the original report to be misfiled under the wrong mineral district. It is long enough for a row of stones on a ridge northeast of Lady Evelyn Lake to be visited by nothing but wind and ravens and the slow, patient work of frost on granite. But things found tend to stay found, eventually. In 1985, an archaeology graduate student named Catherine Morell was working on a thesis about indigenous land use patterns in the Temagami region. She had been given access to historical survey files at the Ministry of Natural Resources as part of her research, and she had the particular quality that makes a good researcher, which is a willingness to read everything, even the things that seem unrelated to what you are looking for. She found Doreen's appendix in March of 1985. She read it twice. Then she drove to Temagami, hired a local guide, and spent 3 days finding the ridge. What she found when she got there had not changed. The 11 stones were still standing. The spacing was still what Doreen had recorded. But Morell had something Doreen had not had, which was a background in lithic analysis and a knowledge of what shaped stone tools looked like and an awareness of the broader literature on megalithic structures around the world. She spent 2 full days on that ridge, measuring, photographing, sketching. She noted something Doreen had either missed or not recognized. On the inner face of 3 of the stones, the faces that pointed toward each other across the line, there were markings. Not deep, not the kind of thing that jumped out at you, but deliberate. Pecked into the granite surface with something hard and pointed, worn now by whatever centuries had passed over them, but still visible if you angled your head correctly and let the low afternoon light fall across the surface just so. The markings were geometric, concentric circles, a series of parallel lines, a shape that Morell described in her field notes as resembling a cup and ring mark, which is a term she knew from the literature on Neolithic monuments in the British Isles and Scandinavia. Cup and ring marks, carved into granite on a ridge in northern Ontario. Morell did not panic. She did not go public. She was 26 years old, and she was trying to finish a thesis, and she understood that making a dramatic claim about pre-Columbian megalithic structures in Canada was not the kind of thing a graduate student did without very careful preparation if she wanted anyone to take her seriously afterward. She went back to her university. She included a chapter in her thesis about the Temagami site. She sent copies of her photographs to 3 senior archaeologists whose work she admired. She received 2 polite non-responses and 1 note suggesting that the markings were likely the result of natural erosion processes. She disagreed, but she set it aside. She had a thesis to finish. She had a career to build. The stones would wait. They had already been waiting a very long time. What Morell could not have known in 1985 was that the Temagami site was not unique. It was not even the most significant example of its kind in Canada. It was simply the one she happened to find, the one she happened to have access to because of a misfiled document in a government office in Sudbury. Across the country, from Newfoundland to Vancouver Island, from the prairie provinces to the high Arctic, similar things had been noticed, recorded briefly, and then set aside. Some had been noticed by surveyors, some by farmers who had ploughed around them for generations, some by hunters and trappers who knew them as landmarks without knowing what they were, and some had been known to indigenous communities for longer than anyone had been writing anything down, known not as anomalies but as ordinary features of a landscape that was itself a kind of document. The Algonquin peoples of the Temagami region had a name for the ridge where Doreen had made his discovery. The name translates roughly as the ridge where the old ones stood, stones on end. It was not a secret name. It was not ceremonial. It was simply descriptive, the way place names often are in indigenous languages, practical names that tell you what a place is or what happened there or what you might find if you go there. The ridge where the old ones stood stones on end. It was in the name all along, and no one had asked. That is one of the recurring textures of this story. The information was available. It was sitting in field reports and in oral traditions, and in the memories of people who lived close to the land and had never had any reason to think the stones were mysterious, because they had always known the stones were there. The mystery was not in the stones. The mystery was in the gap between what local people knew and what the official record was willing to acknowledge. And that gap, it turns out, is very wide. To understand why that gap exists, you have to understand something about the history of Canadian archaeology, which is itself a history of assumptions. When European explorers and settlers arrived in North America, they brought with them a set of ideas about what they expected to find. They expected to find wilderness. They expected to find peoples who had no written history, no monumental architecture, no organized systems of knowledge that resembled European systems of knowledge. They found things that contradicted those expectations at every turn. But the expectations were strong, and the people who held them were in positions of power, and the people who contradicted them were not. And so the official story of the continent was written in a particular way that has taken generations to even begin to revise. The official story said that North America before European contact was a land of small, mobile, essentially prehistoric societies. Hunter-gatherers who moved with the seasons and left no permanent mark on the land. The official story acknowledged some exceptions. Cahokia in Illinois, the Anasazi cliff dwellings of the American Southwest, the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, but it treated these as exceptions, local developments that did not alter the broad picture. The broad picture was wilderness, primitiveness, absence of the kinds of civilizational markers that counted as civilization. That picture has been crumbling for decades. It is not crumbling because of a conspiracy being exposed. It is crumbling because of data. Because of LiDAR surveys that reveal the outlines of ancient cities under the Amazon rainforest, because of soil chemistry studies that show deliberate agricultural modification of land across vast areas of the Americas, because of genetic research that is completely rewriting the story of when people arrived in the Americas and by what routes, because of archaeological discoveries that keep turning up things that should not be there if the official timeline is correct, and in Canada specifically, it is crumbling because of the stones. Not just the stones at Temagami. There are sites in Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula where granite monoliths stand in arrangements that bear a striking resemblance to the dolmens and standing stones of Brittany and Cornwall. There are sites in British Columbia's interior where stone circles and alignments have been documented by researchers who have then spent years trying to get mainstream academic attention paid to them. There are sites in the maritime provinces, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, where coastal erosion is slowly exposing worked stone structures that should, by the accepted chronology, not exist. And there are the deep water discoveries, the ones that almost no one talks about, the anomalous sonar readings in the Great Lakes that suggest large, organized structures beneath the surface of water that has covered them since the glaciers melted and the lakes filled. We are going to move through all of these, slowly, because they deserve that, because the people who found them and spent years trying to be heard deserve that, because the land itself, that vast ancient landscape of rock and water, and boreal forest and tundra and coast, deserves to have its actual history told, rather than the simplified version that fits comfortably inside the existing story. But before we do that, we need to spend some time with the geology. Because the geology is not just background. The geology is almost like a character in this story. The Canadian Shield, that enormous exposed mass of Precambrian rock that covers most of eastern Canada and sweeps down into the upper Midwest of the United States, is the oldest surface rock on Earth in many of its exposures. Parts of it are nearly 4 billion years old, and it sat above the sea through multiple ice ages, was scraped and rearranged by glaciers, and then slowly, as the ice retreated, became the landscape that human beings would eventually inhabit. The last major glaciation ended in Canada roughly 10,000 years ago, though the ice retreated at different rates in different regions. By about 8,000 years ago, much of what is now Ontario and Quebec and the maritime provinces was ice-free, and the land was being colonized by plants and animals and, according to the conventional timeline, by human beings who had arrived via the Bering Land Bridge sometime between 12 and 15,000 years ago, and had gradually worked their way south and east across the continent. That conventional timeline has been under serious pressure for at least 30 years. The evidence for pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas, meaning human presence before the culture that conventional archaeology had designated as the first, has been accumulating steadily since the 1990s. Sites in Chile and Brazil and Virginia and Texas have produced dates that are simply incompatible with the idea that the Americas were first settled by a single wave of migration 12 to 15,000 years ago. The story is more complicated than that. There were probably multiple migrations. There were probably people in parts of South America before there were people in what is now Canada. And there may, in some areas, have been continuous human presence for much longer than anyone has been comfortable saying out loud. This matters for the Canadian megalith story because the stones are very old. Not all of them. Some of the alignments that have been documented are almost certainly the work of indigenous peoples in more recent millennia, but some of them are older. The question of how much older is one of the things that makes this story so difficult to fit into existing frameworks. Organic material found in direct association with some of these sites has produced radiocarbon dates that push into the 7, 8, 9,000 year range, which means that some of these structures were being built, or at least were already standing, before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before the great megalithic monuments of Malta and Ireland and the Orkney Islands that we think of as the earliest examples of organized stone construction by human societies. If those dates hold, which been researchers who produced them believe they do, then what we are looking at in Canada is not a local curiosity or an anomaly in the historical record. We are looking at evidence of a tradition of organized, intentional, sophisticated stone construction that is as old as anything on Earth. We are looking at evidence that the Canadian Shield, that ancient rock surface, was walked by people who knew what they were doing for far longer than we have given them credit for. And we are looking at evidence of something else. Something that the geographic distribution of these sites begins to suggest when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. These sites are not random. They are not scattered across the landscape the way random things scatter. They cluster. They cluster along water routes. They cluster at points of elevation from which large distances can be observed. They cluster at locations where particular astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, are observable from the ground with unusual clarity. That clustering is information. It is not proof of any specific civilization or any specific culture, but it is evidence of pattern. And pattern, in archaeology as in everything else, is evidence of intention. Whoever placed these stones knew what they were doing, and they were doing it across a landscape the size of a continent. The Gaspé Peninsula reaches into the Gulf of St. Lawrence like a long arm, its northern shore rising steeply from the water into the Chic-Choc Mountains, its southern shore gentler and more agricultural. It is one of the most beautiful landscapes in eastern Canada, and it has been inhabited for a very long time. The Mi'kmaq people have lived there for at least 10,000 years, and their oral histories speak of a landscape that was inhabited before them, shaped by people who came before, in a time that is not easy to describe in terms of years because the oral histories do not work that way. In 1994, a retired schoolteacher named René Beauchamp began systematically documenting unusual stone formations in the interior of the peninsula. Beauchamp was not an archaeologist. He was a man in his 60s who had grown up in the region, who knew its forests and its ridges and its stream valleys with the intimacy of someone who had spent a lifetime walking them. He had noticed things over the years, things that he had always assumed someone more qualified than him would eventually explain. When no explanation came, he decided to document what he was seeing himself. Over the course of 6 years, Beauchamp documented 47 sites in the Gaspé interior. 47 locations where stone had been arranged in ways that he was confident were not natural. He photographed them. He described them in careful handwritten notes. He took compass bearings and noted the relationships between stones within each site and between sites and prominent geographical features and astronomical events. And when he had finished, he wrote a report and sent it to the archaeology department at Université Laval. The report was received. It was read by at least one faculty member who wrote back to Beauchamp acknowledging its receipt and saying that the sites he described sounded interesting and that perhaps a student might visit them at some future point. No student was assigned. No visit was made. Beauchamp died in 2003, and his handwritten notes were donated by his family to a regional historical society in the Gaspé town of Percé, where they sat in archival boxes for another 12 years. In 2015, a researcher named Sylvie Tremblay, working on a broader project about Mi'kmaq archaeology in Quebec, encountered a reference to Beauchamp's work in a footnote in an obscure journal article. She tracked down the notes. She spent 3 months in Persay, reading them. Then she spent 2 field seasons visiting the sites Beauchamp had documented. Of the 47 sites he had recorded, 39 were still intact. 8 had been disturbed by forestry operations or road building. Of the 39 intact sites, Tremblay found that all of them were genuine anomalies. None of them could be explained as natural formations, and 22 of them showed what she described as clear astronomical alignments, orientations towards sunrise or sunset at solstice or equinox, that were too precise to be coincidental. Tremblay was more experienced than Beauchamp at navigating academic institutions. She knew how to frame things. She published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal. She was careful with her language. She described the sites as requiring further investigation. She did not use the word megalithic. She did not invoke comparisons to European Neolithic monuments. She stayed within the acceptable boundaries of what a cautious academic could say, without inviting professional ridicule. The paper was published. It was cited exactly once in the following 3 years, in another paper by Tremblay herself. The sites she documented are still there, in the Gaspé interior, aligned to the same skies they have been aligned to for whatever thousands of years they have been standing. British Columbia is where the story gets larger and stranger and more difficult to contain within any single explanatory framework. The province is a place of almost absurd geographic variety. Its coast is a maze of fjords and islands and mountain ranges that drop directly into the Pacific. Its interior is a mix of plateau and canyon and boreal forest and grassland steppe. Its northern regions shade into the subarctic, and it was inhabited, before European contact, by a diversity of peoples whose cultures and languages and systems of knowledge were as varied as the geography itself. Among those peoples, the traditions concerning ancient stone structures are particularly rich. The interior Salish peoples, the Secwepemc and Silks and Lakapamuks, all have oral traditions about places in the landscape where stones stand in meaningful arrangements. These are not secret traditions. They are discussed, though not always in detail and not always with outsiders, because the relationship between what is sacred and what is public is calibrated differently in these cultures than in the cultures that wrote the official history of Canada. A researcher named David Suttles, working in the 1970s and 1980s, collected accounts from Secwepemc elders about sites in the Thompson River Valley where large stones had been placed to mark important locations. The accounts were consistent across multiple informants and across generations. They agreed on the locations, the general configurations, and the significance of the structures as markers of events and boundaries and knowledge that was old even in living memory. Suttles found some of these sites. He photographed them and recorded their coordinates and noted their relationship to the landscape. He also noted something that struck him as significant. Several of the sites were positioned at locations that a geologist or a hydrologist would have chosen for exactly the same reason. They commanded views. They sat above junctions of waterways. They were at places where a person standing on them could see a very long way. That practical quality, the sense that these structures were placed not just for symbolic or ritual reasons, but for reasons that also had to do with navigation and communication, and the organization of movement across a large landscape, is one of the things that keeps appearing in the documentation of these sites across Canada. The stones are not randomly distributed. They are placed where they would be useful to a society that needed to organize itself across a very large territory without written language or electronic communication, a society that used the landscape itself as a kind of infrastructure. Which raises a question: what kind of society needs infrastructure like that? Not a small band of nomadic hunter-gatherers moving opportunistically across the land. Infrastructure of that kind is built by societies that have territories, that have established routes, that communicate between communities over distances, that need to coordinate activities in time and space. Infrastructure of that kind is built by societies that are more organized, more settled, more complex than the official narrative of pre-Columbian Canada has ever been willing to acknowledge. The word complex is one that mainstream archaeology applies very sparingly to pre-contact North American societies, and when it does, it tends to apply it to the societies of the American Southwest, or to the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley, or to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Great Lakes region, which was organized enough that Benjamin Franklin drew on its political philosophy when helping to design the United States government. But even in those acknowledged cases, the language tends to be hedged. The word civilization is almost never used. Civilization, in the dominant historical vocabulary, means cities. It means writing. It means the specific configuration of economic and political complexity that developed in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley. If it does not look like that, then it is something else, something lesser, something that does not quite deserve the same word. But the stones do not care what words we use for them. They stand where they were placed, they align with what they were oriented to align with, and they suggest, with the quiet insistence of things that have been waiting for a very long time, that the peoples who placed them were doing something that deserves more serious attention than it has received. In 2003, a satellite image analyst named Marcus Webb was reviewing imagery from what is now a decommissioned surveillance satellite program when he noticed something in the imagery covering a remote region of Ontario's far north. He was not supposed to be reviewing this imagery for any reason related to archaeology. He was reviewing it for reasons related to forest fire monitoring. But the human eye, particularly a trained eye, notices patterns. And the pattern he noticed in the imagery was a series of geometrically regular clearings in the boreal forest, clearings that formed a shape he described in a note to himself as looking like a deliberate arrangement. Webb was not an archaeologist either. He was a remote sensing specialist. But he was curious, and he had the analytical tools to do something with his curiosity. He extracted the imagery, corrected it, enhanced it, and spent 3 weeks measuring the clearings. What he found was that the clearings, which appeared to be approximately 5 to 8 kilometers apart from each other, formed a pattern that was not random. They were aligned, not perfectly, not with the precision of a surveyor's instrument, but with the kind of loose regularity that you see in things that were placed intentionally rather than things that arose naturally. He sent an email to a contact at the Royal Ontario Museum. He attached his imagery analysis. He described what he had found in careful, qualified terms, acknowledging all the alternative explanations and being clear about the limits of what satellite imagery could tell you about what was on the ground. He asked if anyone at the ROM would be interested in following up. The contact forwarded the email to a colleague. The colleague forwarded it to a graduate student. The graduate student replied to Webb 3 weeks later, saying that the clearings were most likely natural peatland features called patterned fens, which were known to produce geometrically regular shapes in remote sensing imagery. Webb looked up patterned fens. He was familiar with them. He agreed that some of what he had seen could be explained that way, but not all of it. The alignments he had identified persisted, even when the features most likely to be patterned fens were removed from the analysis. He wrote back to the graduate student explaining this. He did not receive a reply. He continued his analysis on his own time for another 2 years, producing a detailed report that he self-published online in 2006. The report attracted a small but devoted readership among people interested in alternative archaeology. It attracted no attention from mainstream institutions. The pattern of discovery and dismissal that runs through these accounts is not unique to Canada. It is a pattern that anyone who spends time in the literature of unconventional archaeology will recognize from every continent. But in Canada, it has a particular quality, a particular flavor, that has to do with the specific history of Canada and with the specific relationship between Canadian institutions and the idea of Indigenous history. Canada is a country that has been in the process, for the last several decades, of slowly and painfully reckoning with what it did to its Indigenous peoples. The residential school system, the 60s scoop, the ongoing crises of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, the underfunding of Indigenous communities and services, these are not historical grievances. They are present realities that Canadian institutions are still struggling to address. And the reckoning with this history has inevitably raised questions about what else was suppressed, what else was misrepresented, what else was set aside because it did not fit the story that those in power wanted to tell. The suppression of Indigenous knowledge is part of this broader pattern. For generations, the oral traditions of Indigenous peoples in Canada were treated by academic and government institutions as folklore at best and as irrelevant noise at worst. The idea that those traditions might contain accurate historical information about events that happened thousands of years ago was not taken seriously. The idea that those traditions might in some cases be more accurate than the academic literature was not considered at all. This is changing, slowly. There is now a body of research demonstrating that Indigenous oral traditions do preserve accurate information over very long time periods. The most dramatic example comes from Australia, where Yulingu and other Aboriginal oral traditions describe geographical features, including the locations of coastlines and the presence of megafauna, that are consistent with what we now know from geology and paleontology about conditions that existed as long as 10,000 years ago. The traditions are, in other words, accurate accounts of things that happened when the landscape looked different, preserved through continuous oral transmission across hundreds of generations. If that is possible in Australia, it is possible in Canada. And the oral traditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples contain many references to times and conditions that sound, to people who know what to listen for, like accounts of a very different world. Accounts of when the ice was still retreating. Accounts of when the sea was closer than it is now. Accounts of peoples and structures and events that the official archaeological timeline has not yet found a way to accommodate. The Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region have oral traditions about an ancient civilization that they call the Mishi-Biju people, a term that translates roughly as the people of the Great Water Spirit. These are not supernatural beings in the tradition. They are people. Ancient people who were skilled in the working of stone and copper, and who built structures of enduring permanence along the shores of the lakes and rivers of the region. The traditions describe them as having come before, as having been there before the Anishinaabe themselves arrived in the region, which according to the Anishinaabes' own oral history happened a very long time ago. The oral history of the Anishinaabe places their arrival in the Great Lakes region at the end of a long westward migration from an origin point somewhere on the Atlantic coast. This migration is described in considerable detail, with named stopping points and specific events, and researchers who have taken the time to map the migration against the known archaeology of the region have found that the major stopping points in the oral history correlate with known archaeological sites in ways that are too consistent to be coincidental. If the Anishinaabe oral history is accurate, and there are reasons to believe it is, then the Mishi-Biju people, whoever they were in the Great Lakes region before the Anishinaabe arrived, before the migration that the oral history describes in detail, which pushes the Mishi-Biju back into a time that conventional archaeology has barely begun to think about in relation to North America. The copper is an important part of this story. The Lake Superior Basin contains the largest known deposits of native copper in the world. Native copper, copper that occurs in its pure metallic form without needing to be smelted from ore, was worked by the peoples of the Great Lakes region for a very long time. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, is one of the most extraordinary but least discussed chapters in North American prehistory. For roughly 4,000 years, from about 6,000 to about 3,000 years ago, the peoples of the Great Lakes region were mining copper on an industrial scale. They were making tools and weapons and ornaments that appear in archaeological sites across the eastern half of North America. They were trading copper objects over distances of hundreds and in some cases thousands of kilometers. They had a level of metallurgical knowledge and organizational capacity that is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the prevailing image of pre-contact North Americans as small-scale hunter-gatherers. And then, around 3,000 years ago, the Old Copper Complex seems to stop. The mining continues, but the scale drops dramatically. The trade networks diminish. Something changed. What changed is not known, or at least not yet known with any certainty, but the scale of what preceded the change is only beginning to be appreciated. The mines themselves are extraordinary. On the Keweenaw Peninsula in what is now Michigan, and on Michipicoten Island and other islands in Lake Superior on the Canadian side, there are ancient mine workings of a scale that should not be possible given what we think we know about the societies that created them. Tens of thousands of mining pits, hundreds of thousands of tons of rock moved, evidence of organized, systematic extraction on a scale that required coordination across a large labor force over a long period of time. Some estimates suggest that in the most intensive period of the Old Copper Complex, somewhere between 2,000 and 1,000 tons of copper were extracted from the Lake Superior Basin. That is enough copper to account for the copper objects found in archaeological sites across North America, with a margin that has never been satisfactorily explained. The archaeology accounts for some of the copper, but not all of it. Where did the rest go? One answer, offered by researchers who have looked carefully at the genetic and archaeological record, is that it went north and east and eventually out of the continent. The suggestion is controversial. It involves evidence that is fragmentary and contested, but it is not as easily dismissed as some people would prefer it to be. The suggestion is that some of the copper from the Great Lakes moved through trade networks across what is now Canada, and eventually reached the Atlantic coast, and was acquired by peoples who were themselves in maritime contact with cultures on the other side of the Atlantic. This is not the mainstream view. The mainstream view is that sustained transatlantic contact before Columbus is essentially impossible to demonstrate and very unlikely to have occurred. But the minority view, argued by researchers who have spent decades examining the evidence, is that the Atlantic Ocean was not the absolute barrier it is sometimes portrayed as. The Norse presence in North America is not controversial. Lance Ore Meadows in Newfoundland is a confirmed Norse settlement dating to approximately 1,000 years ago. But the Norse were not the first people to cross the Atlantic from Europe to North America, or so the minority argument goes. There is genetic evidence suggesting contact between Western Europeans and Eastern North Americans much earlier than the Norse period. There are linguistic parallels, phonological similarities between certain Algonquian languages and certain European languages, that some researchers find too consistent to be coincidental. And there are the megaliths themselves, the cup and ring marks on granite in Ontario that Catherine Morell found in 1985, the dolmen-like structures of the Gaspé Peninsula, the orientations to astronomical events that the megalithic traditions of Atlantic Europe also favoured. None of this is proof. Let me be clear about that. This is a territory of evidence that is genuinely ambiguous, where the data is real but the interpretation is contested, where the mainstream position is defended with arguments that have merit, and the alternative positions are advanced by researchers who also have merit. The truth here is not simple. It may not be knowable with the tools currently available to us. But the fact that it is not simple is itself important. It means the story is more interesting, more complicated, more human than the simplified version we have been taught. The simplified version says, empty land, arriving peoples, gradual development, European contact, colonization. The complicated version says, thousands of years of sophisticated human activity, complex trade networks, possible long-distance contact, rich traditions of knowledge and placemaking that were disrupted and suppressed rather than simply absent. The complicated version is the one the stones support. The stones at Temagami and in the Gaspé interior and along the Thompson River, and in whatever that satellite imagery was, showing Marcus Webb in the Ontario far north. The stones support a complicated version, and complicated versions are uncomfortable, which is perhaps part of why they have been so consistently set aside. Let us go now to the coast of British Columbia, to the site that has, in the last decade or so, attracted more sustained attention than almost any other in this story. The site is on a small island in the Haida Gwaii archipelago, formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, off the northern coast of British Columbia. It does not have an official archaeological designation yet. The researchers who have been working on it have been careful about publication, partly because of the sensitivity of the site's relationship to the Haida Nation, on whose traditional territory it sits. What the site contains is a series of stone structures on a headland that looks northwest across the Pacific. The structures include what appear to be the foundations of several large buildings, alignments of standing stones that mirror the orientation of the headland itself, and a series of carved boulders that bear markings similar to those found at other Canadian sites, but also with features that have no clear North American parallels. The site has been dated through optical luminescence dating of sand beneath the stone structures to approximately 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago, Haida Gwaii was still emerging from the effects of the last ice age. The sea level was different, the climate was different, the vegetation was different. The people who were on those islands at that time, and there were people there, were navigating a landscape that would be barely recognizable to someone familiar with the modern archipelago. They were also, apparently, building things. The Haida themselves are clear that the site is ancient, and that it falls within the category of places that are described in their oral traditions as having been made by the ancestors, by people who were there before the present-day Haida cultural tradition took its current form. The Haida are not in the habit of making things up about their own history. They are a people who have maintained extraordinarily detailed and coherent oral traditions about their history and their landscape for a very long time. When they say something is old and made by the ancestors, they tend to mean exactly that. The researchers who have been working at the site, with the cooperation and oversight of the Haida Nation, have documented several things that they describe as genuinely unprecedented in the archaeology of the northwest coast. The scale of the structures is one of them. The largest of the building foundations covers an area of roughly 400 square meters. That is not a small structure. That is a substantial building. The kind of building that is associated, in other parts of the world, with communities that have a degree of permanence and organization that goes significantly beyond what the stereotype of the nomadic Pacific Coast peoples suggests. The carvings are another. There are 12 carved boulders at the site, ranging in size from about 1/2 meter to nearly 2 meters across. The carvings are on the upper surfaces of the boulders, protected by a thin patina of biological growth that the dating team used to establish their antiquity. The designs include spirals, concentric circles, and a series of interconnected lines that form a pattern which one researcher, who had spent years studying rock art from Neolithic sites in Western Ireland, described privately as deeply familiar in its general logic, while being unlike anything I have seen from this part of the world. Deeply familiar, unlike anything from this part of the world. That combination is either enormously significant or enormously misleading, and working out which requires a kind of careful attention to evidence that takes years and produces conclusions that are genuinely, honestly uncertain. The researchers at the Haida Gwaii site have not published their main findings yet. They are being careful. They are in ongoing consultation with the Haida Nation about how the findings should be shared and in what form. They are aware that making dramatic claims about ancient cross-cultural contact based on superficial formal similarities in rock art is a thing that has been done before and done badly, producing more heat than light. But they are also aware of what they have found, and they are finding it difficult to contain within any existing explanatory framework. Meanwhile, in the interior of the country, a different kind of discovery has been proceeding on a different timeline. The prairies of Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba are not a landscape that most people associate with ancient stone monuments. They are flat. They are exposed. They are, in the popular imagination, essentially empty, except for wheat fields and the occasional grain elevator standing against a wide sky. The popular imagination is wrong about this in several important ways, and one of the most important ways involves the stone structures. The prairie provinces contain a remarkable concentration of what archaeologists call medicine wheels and related stone alignments. The most famous of these is the Majorville medicine wheel in Alberta, a large stone cairn at the centre of a circle of stones, connected by radiating lines of stones, like the spokes of a wheel. The Majorville structure has been dated, through the archaeological material found in its central cairn, to approximately 5,000 years ago. It is one of the oldest ceremonial structures in North America. It is also one of the least visited, sitting in a remote pasture on private land, accessible by a dirt track that is impassable in wet weather. But Majorville is not the only site of its kind on the prairies. There are hundreds of them. Hundreds of stone circles and alignments and cairns distributed across the 3 prairie provinces, documented in surveys going back to the early 20th century, but never systematically studied as a network, never analysed together in a way that might reveal what their distribution and their collective properties could tell us about the peoples who made them. A researcher named Gordon Freeman spent decades trying to do exactly that. Freeman was a chemistry professor at the University of Alberta, not an archaeologist, which meant he brought a different set of analytical tools to the problem, but also meant he was not taken entirely seriously by the archaeological establishment, which has a tendency, like all academic disciplines, to be territorial about its methods and its questions. Freeman's analysis of the prairie stone structures convinced him that they formed a coherent astronomical calendar system, a way of tracking the movements of the sun and moon across a prairie sky that was used by peoples of the region over thousands of years for agricultural and ceremonial coordination. His evidence was detailed, and his methodology was careful. He published it. He spoke about it at conferences. He was invited to present at some quite prestigious venues, and the reaction he received was one that many unconventional researchers will recognize: polite interest, occasional enthusiasm from individual researchers, and then a return to institutional inertia. The calendar hypothesis was neither definitively refuted nor definitively accepted. It was set aside, added to the long list of things that might be important, but that the field did not currently have the resources or the inclination to pursue. The Cree and Nakota and Blackfoot peoples of the prairies have their own accounts of the stone structures. Like the Algonquin accounts of the Temagami stones, these accounts are matter of fact rather than mysterious. The structures are there. They have always been there. They were placed by people who understood things about the sky that it is useful to understand if you are living on the prairies, and you need to know when to move and when to plant, and when to expect the animals to return, and when the cold season will end. The structures are a technology. They are a response to the practical problem of living in a place with an enormous sky, and with seasons that can kill you if you misread them. That framing, the structures as practical technology rather than as mystical monuments, is one that the indigenous communities themselves tend to prefer, and it is a framing that changes the way you think about the people who built them. It shifts them from the romantic but condescending category of primitive stone worshippers into the straightforwardly practical category of people solving real problems with the tools available to them. The tools available to them happen to be, among other things, stone and sky, and a very sophisticated understanding of the relationships between them. The sophistication required to design and build an accurate astronomical calendar in stone is not trivial. It requires long-term observation, the ability to track celestial events over years and decades, and then record that knowledge in a durable medium. It requires mathematical thinking, the ability to abstract from particular observations to general principles and then apply those principles in a constructed form. It requires social organization, the ability to coordinate labor across a community over a period of time longer than any individual's attention span. These are not simple capabilities. They are the capabilities of people who are, by any reasonable definition, sophisticated. The tradition of treating pre-contact North American peoples as less sophisticated than they were is not innocent. It served specific political purposes at specific historical moments. If the land was uninhabited or inhabited only by primitive peoples who had not developed it in any meaningful way, then the European appropriation of that land could be framed as something other than theft. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, the empty land, which was used to justify colonization in both North America and Australia, depended on a particular characterization of the peoples who were already there. A characterization that persistent archaeology has been dismantling for decades, though the political implications of that dismantling are still being worked out. The stone structures of Canada are part of this larger story. They are evidence against terra nullius. They are evidence that the land was not empty, was not unmarked, was not uninhabited by peoples with no lasting relationship to it. They are evidence of human presence and human purpose on a scale and over a time scale that the colonizing narrative could not accommodate and therefore tended not to see. But they are also, and this is important, evidence of something that deserves to be valued on its own terms, not just as a corrective to European misrepresentation. They are evidence of a tradition of engagement with landscape and with the cosmos that is as rich and as intellectually serious as any tradition of which we know. A tradition that asks the same questions that all sophisticated human cultures ask. Where are we? How long have we been here? How should we mark our presence? How should we align ourselves with the forces that shape our world? A tradition that answered those questions in stone, in the arrangement of rocks on a ridge, or in a circle on a prairie, or on a headland above the Pacific, answers that are still there, still readable by anyone who takes the time to go and look. Labrador is the part of Canada that most people never think about at all. It is a vast territory of subarctic wilderness, attached to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Its interior, a landscape of boreal forest and tundra lakes and rivers that drain north into the Labrador Sea. It is cold and remote and beautiful, in a severe, uncompromising way, and it has been continuously inhabited by the Innu and Inuit peoples for thousands of years. In 1978, a construction crew working on the Trans-Labrador Highway stumbled onto a site that they did not know what to do with. They were clearing a section of rock for the roadbed when a bulldozer operator named Henry Parsons noticed that the rocks he was pushing aside were not random. They had been arranged. He stopped the bulldozer. He walked through what he had uncovered. He went back to camp and told his foreman that someone needed to come and look at what was out there. The foreman called the project engineer. The project engineer called the Provincial Heritage Office. The Provincial Heritage Office sent a heritage officer named Louise Chabot 3 weeks later, by which point the bulldozer had moved considerably more material than it had when Parsons first noticed something was wrong. But there was still enough remaining to make Chabot's inspection extremely interesting. What remained was a section of what had been a much larger structure. A row of upright stones, each between 1/2 meter and 1 meter tall, set into the permafrost with their bases apparently buried to a depth of several centimeters. The uprights formed 2 parallel lines approximately 4 meters apart, running northeast to southwest. The remaining length of the structure after the bulldozer's work was approximately 30 meters, but the alignment of the stones and the character of the soil disturbance on both sides of the excavated section suggested that the original structure had been much longer. Chabot measured what was there. She photographed it. She collected soil samples. She reported that the structure appeared to be very old, that the degree to which the stones had settled into the permafrost was consistent with great antiquity, and that the site should be protected pending further investigation. She recommended that the highway project be rerouted to avoid the site. The highway project was not rerouted. It was delayed for 7 weeks while the Heritage Office negotiated with the construction company. At the end of 7 weeks, a compromise was reached that allowed the highway to proceed on its original alignment with minor adjustments. removing approximately 60% of the remaining structure in the process. What was left was carefully documented, and a report was filed. The report recommended future excavation. The future excavation has not yet occurred. The soil samples Chabot collected were eventually dated. The results, obtained in 1991 from a laboratory in Ottawa, suggested that the soil disturbance associated with the stone placement was at least 4,000 years old, possibly older. The dating method used had a margin of error of several hundred years, which meant the structure could have been placed as long as 5,000 years ago or as recently as 3,500. The 4,000-year midpoint estimate was used in subsequent references to the site, 4,000 years ago in Labrador. There were people on that coastline 4,000 years ago. The Dorset culture, predecessor to the Thule culture that gave rise to the modern Inuit, was active in the region. The Innu, or their ancestors, were in the interior. But neither culture has left a record of stone construction of this kind. The Dorset culture's sites are characterized by tent rings and small stone caches and middens. They are not characterized by aligned rows of upright stones running for tens of meters across the landscape. So who built the Labrador structure? The honest answer is that we do not know. The structure was too disturbed before its significance was recognized. Too much of it was lost to the bulldozer's work, and the subsequent lack of investigation has meant that the questions Chabot's 1,978 report raised have simply remained unanswered. They sit alongside all the other unanswered questions, all the other sites that were found and documented and then not followed up, all the other appendices in all the other survey reports that never got forwarded to the people who might have known what to do with them. The pattern of unanswered questions is itself a kind of evidence. It tells you something about what questions a society is interested in pursuing and what questions it is comfortable leaving alone. And for a very long time, Canadian institutions have been comfortable leaving these particular questions alone. Not through malice, mostly. Not through a coordinated conspiracy to suppress the truth about Canadian prehistory, but through the slower, less dramatic process of institutional inertia, underfunding, disciplinary conservatism, and the general tendency of official history to prefer a story it already knows over a story that might require it to rethink everything. But the evidence keeps accumulating, and at some point, the weight of accumulated evidence becomes too great for institutional inertia to hold. We are, arguably, approaching that point now. The combination of new dating technologies, satellite and aerial remote sensing, genetic analysis, and a genuinely changing relationship between academic archaeology and indigenous knowledge holders is producing a picture of pre-contact North America that is increasingly difficult to reconcile with the old story. The old story of small groups, simple technologies, empty land. The new picture is of a continent that was dense with human presence, rich with human knowledge, marked in permanent and semi-permanent ways by peoples who are far more sophisticated than the story we were told ever gave them credit for. Canada is at the center of this new picture because Canada is where some of the most significant evidence is located and where some of the most interesting collaboration between Indigenous knowledge holders and academic researchers is beginning to happen. The truth and reconciliation process, whatever its limitations, has opened conversations that had been closed for generations. Indigenous scholars and knowledge keepers are increasingly present in academic institutions and in the conversations that determine what gets studied and how. And the oral traditions that were dismissed for so long are being taken seriously in new ways, not as folklore, but as data. What those traditions say, across many nations and many regions and many different articulations, is consistent in its broad outlines. The land is very old. People have been here for a very long time. Those people were not simple. They built things and they knew things and they marked the landscape with their knowledge in ways that are still visible to anyone who is willing to look. The stones are there. Go and look at the stones. There are people who are going to look at the stones. Increasingly, there are people with the tools and the institutional support and the genuine curiosity to go and look at the stones in ways that can tell us something real about what they are and who placed them and when and why. Researchers like Catherine Morell and Sylvie Tremblay and Gordon Freeman and the unnamed team currently working at the Haida Gwaii site are at the edge of something. They are at the edge of a significant revision of the official history of this continent, a revision that has been coming for decades and that the stones themselves have been patiently waiting for. Let us take a moment to breathe with that. The stones are patiently waiting. That is a phrase that deserves to sit in the air for a second. There is something almost unbearable about the patience of very old things, the patience of mountains, the patience of deep water. The patience of stones that have been standing on a ridge for 7,000 years, aligned to a sky that has not changed, marking a knowledge that was once so important that someone moved multi-ton blocks of granite to preserve it. We do not move multi-ton blocks of granite unless we think it matters, unless we think the knowledge we are preserving is worth the enormous effort of preserving it in that way, in a form durable enough to outlast the people who made it, and the people who came after them, and the people who came after them too, in a form durable enough to still be standing when whoever comes next finally asks the right question. Someone thought the knowledge mattered enough for that. Many someones, across a very large geography and a very long time. And whatever the knowledge was, whatever the system of understanding that motivated the placement of these stones, it was coherent enough and consistent enough that you can see its traces in the Gaspé Peninsula, and on the Ontario Shield, and on a headland in Haida Gwaii, and in the prairie grasslands of Saskatchewan, and on a highway cut in Labrador. Coherent enough, perhaps, to represent a tradition, a continuous or at least a linked tradition of engaging with landscape and with sky in a particular way that stretched across a continent and across millennia. What was that tradition? This is where we move into territory that is genuinely speculative, where the evidence is not sufficient to draw firm conclusions, and where intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that we are extrapolating from fragments. But extrapolation from fragments is what history always is, because the past does not leave complete records, it leaves pieces, and we do what we can with the pieces we have. The fragments we have suggest a tradition that was fundamentally astronomical. The consistent orientation of these sites toward solstice and equinox positions, toward the rising and setting of particular stars, toward the lunar standstill cycle, which repeats every 18.6 years, and which several of these sites appear to be oriented to observe, suggests that the knowledge being preserved was primarily knowledge of the sky, specifically, knowledge of the sky in its relationship to the passage of time. Time is crucial for any society that needs to coordinate its activities across a large geography. You cannot tell people in one community to meet people from another community at a particular place if you do not have a shared system for expressing when. You cannot coordinate the planting of crops or the harvesting of wild foods or the movement to winter quarters or the scheduling of large gatherings without some way of marking and communicating time. A society that has built stone structures aligned to astronomically determinable events has built a shared clock. Everyone who knows how to read the structures knows what time it is, in the large seasonal sense that matters for coordination across distance. This is not a mystical function. It is a practical one. The mystical dimension comes later, when the practical is embedded in ceremony and story and tradition, when the structures that were originally built to tell time become sacred places, become the locations of ritual, become the centers of a cosmology that explains the world in terms of the relationships between earth and sky. The practical and the sacred are not opposites. They tend, in most human cultures, to reinforce each other. The calendar stone and the ceremonial space are often the same stone. The copper trade routes that the old copper complex evidence makes visible may have followed the same lines as the stone marker network. Or they may have been distinct, organized around different logistics, but they intersect in the imagination of what a coherent, organized, continent-wide trading network in pre-contact North America would have looked like. Imagine a landscape where the major waterways, the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa and the Great Lakes and the Saguenay and the Saskatchewan river systems, are not just natural features but organized trade arteries, where the stone structures at intervals along the ridges above those waterways mark distances and calendar positions, and perhaps also territorial boundaries, where the copper that comes out of the Lake Superior Basin moves along those arteries in one direction, and other goods, foods and furs and possibly information move in the other direction, where a community on the Atlantic coast knows when to expect a trading party from the interior, because the stones on the ridge above their harbour tell them what time of year it is, and they have been exchanging parties at this time of year, for longer than anyone now living can remember. That is a picture. It is not a proven fact. It is a picture assembled from fragments, from Doreen's field notes and Morrell's cup and ring marks and Beauchamp's handwritten reports, and Freeman's astronomical alignments, and the stories that Algonquin elders tell about the ridge, where the old ones stood stones on end. It is a picture that the fragments are consistent with, even if they do not definitively prove it. And it is a picture that renders pre-contact Canada as a place that was alive with human intelligence and purpose and organization in ways that the official history has never managed to fully convey. What happened to this tradition? That is the question underneath the question, the one that gives the whole story its elegiac quality. The stone structures are still there, but the knowledge that animated them, the living understanding of what they were and what they meant and how to read them, that knowledge was largely lost. Not all at once, not through any single event, but through the accumulating catastrophes of the centuries after European contact, the epidemics that killed between 50 and 90% of indigenous populations in North America, the displacement and dispossession that separated peoples from their lands and therefore from the landscape features that encoded their knowledge, the residential school system that deliberately broke the chains of oral transmission that had carried knowledge across generations for millennia. The knowledge was not all lost. Some of it survived, in the oral traditions that were maintained despite everything, in the practices that continued underground, in ceremony and story, when they could not continue openly, in the landscapes themselves, which preserve information in their own way, in the orientation of stones and the alignment of sight lines, and the relationship between a marker on a ridge and the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the longest day. The knowledge that is gone is the interpretive knowledge, the human knowledge of how to read the stones. The stones themselves are still legible if you learn the language. Learning the language is what the best of the current research is trying to do, and increasingly it is doing so in collaboration with the knowledge holders who have maintained the thread, however thinly, across the generations of disruption. The collaboration is not always easy. There are legitimate questions about who benefits from the discovery of these sites, about who controls the narrative, about what it means for an academic institution to publish findings about indigenous cultural heritage without sufficient involvement of the communities whose heritage it is. These questions are being worked through, case by case, site by site, in conversations that are sometimes difficult and sometimes remarkably productive. The Haida Nation's involvement in the investigation of the Haida Gwaii site is one model of how this can work. The Haida have been clear about what they want from the research. They want the site to be protected. They want findings to be shared with the community before they are shared publicly. They want Haida interpretive frameworks to be genuinely considered alongside academic frameworks, rather than treated as supplementary colour to the main story. They want to be co-investigators rather than informants, and the researchers who are working at the site have, by all accounts, been trying to honour those requirements. It is an imperfect process, as all human processes are, but it is a process that is producing something more honest and probably more accurate than the old model of academic extraction. The old model went in, took what it needed, published without permission, and left. The new model acknowledges that the knowledge holders and the academic researchers are both necessary to understanding these sites fully. The knowledge that survived in oral tradition tells you things about a site that no amount of lithic analysis or astronomical calculation can tell you. The lithic analysis and the astronomical calculation tell you things that oral tradition alone cannot preserve across very long time periods. Together, they produce something richer than either can produce alone. There is a site in Nova Scotia that has been known to the local Mi'kmaq community for generations and to academic archaeology for about 40 years. It is on a coastal headland south of Digby, on the Bay of Fundy, and it consists of a series of large granite boulders arranged in a pattern that, from the ground, does not look particularly organized, but that from any elevation reveals itself as a carefully designed ensemble. The boulders mark a solar calendar. The shadow of a particular boulder at summer solstice sunrise falls exactly on a cut mark on a specific boulder 40 meters away. The relationship is too precise to be accidental. Someone designed it. The Mi'kmaq call this place by a name that translates as the place where the shadows speak. They have always known it was designed. They have always known it was old. An elder named Mary Ann Denny, who passed away in 2019, gave an interview in 2012 in which she described what she knew about the site and what she had been told by her grandmother, who had been told by her grandmother, and so on back along the chain of transmission for as many generations as she could trace. The shadows speak, Denny said. They tell you what time of year it is. They tell you when to plant and when to harvest and when to begin the preparations for the long cold time. The people who made this place knew that the knowledge had to be made permanent. They knew that words can be forgotten, but stone does not forget. Stone does not forget. That is a beautiful and accurate thing. The stones at the place where the shadows speak have been speaking continuously since they were placed. The shadows have been falling on the cut mark at summer solstice sunrise for as long as the stones have been standing. The information encoded in the structure has not changed. It has not degraded. It has not required maintenance or updating. It is simply there, in the relationship between two pieces of granite and the path of the sun across the summer solstice sky, waiting for anyone who knows how to read it. The academic documentation of the Nova Scotia site began in the mid-1980s, when a researcher from Acadia University named Thomas Hennigar began visiting it with a transit and a theodolite and carefully mapping the relationships between the boulders and the astronomical events they aligned to. Hennigar's work confirmed what the Micmac community already knew. The design was intentional. The astronomical alignments were precise. The structure functioned exactly as described. He published his findings in a regional archaeology journal in 1988. The findings were noted. Hennigar received some correspondence from colleagues who found his results interesting. There was no follow-up excavation. There was no program of radiocarbon dating or luminescence dating to establish when the boulders had been placed. The site was not added to any national registry of significant archaeological sites. It remained what it had always been, a coastal headland in Nova Scotia where the shadows speak, known to the community that had always known it and not known to most other people. That is still the case today. The place where the shadows speak is not a tourist destination. It is not an educational site. It is not even particularly well known outside of a small community of researchers and the Micmac community that has always known about it. It is simply there, doing what it has always done, speaking in shadows to anyone patient enough to be there at the right moment. There is a particular quality to the experience of standing at a place like this, a quality that is difficult to describe and that no amount of reading about these sites quite prepares you for. It is the quality of recognition, not personal recognition, not the feeling of having been there before, but a deeper, less personal recognition, the recognition that someone was here before you, not just someone, many someones, across a long succession of seasons and years and generations, standing in more or less this same spot, looking at the same stones, watching the same shadow creep across the same cut mark as the sun rises on the same morning that recurs every year on the longest day. You are not the first person to stand here watching this. You are in a line of watchers that extends back further than you can comfortably imagine. And whatever you feel in that moment, standing in that line, watching that shadow, it is probably something like what every person in the line before you has felt. A sense of scale, a sense of participation in something larger than your individual life, a sense that the universe is not indifferent, that it has patterns, that those patterns are readable, that someone took the trouble to teach you how to read them. This is what these structures were for. Not just for practical coordination, not just for agricultural timing, for this feeling, for the transmission of the feeling that the universe has patterns and that human beings can understand them. That is knowledge worth preserving in stone. The Haida Gwaii site is on a headland that faces northwest. The direction is significant. Northwest is where the Pacific horizon is, where the storms come from in winter, where the sun sets near the summer solstice. From the headland, you can see a very long way. On a clear day, which is not as rare in Haida Gwaii as the climate might suggest, you can see 80 or 100 kilometers of ocean, the long, flat line of the horizon meeting the long, flat line of the sky. The researchers who have spent time at the site describe a particular quality to the location, the scale of it, the sense of being at an edge, a definitive edge, where the known world ends and the unknown world begins. Someone chose this place deliberately. They chose it because of the view, because of what the view communicated about where you were in the world, at the edge of the land, looking out across the largest ocean on Earth. The Haida have a concept that translates roughly as the place where the land ends and the knowledge begins. It is a concept with both geographic and epistemological dimensions. Geographically, it describes the coastal headlands where you can see the ocean horizon clearly. Epistemologically, it describes the limit of what is known and the beginning of what must be understood through other means than direct observation. The place where the land ends and the knowledge begins is a threshold. It is a place for coming to the edge of what you know and asking questions about what lies beyond. The carved boulders at the Haida Gwaii site, the ones with the spirals and the concentric circles and the interconnected lines, face that horizon. They face northwest, toward where the Pacific begins. They were placed by people who are looking at what lies beyond the edge of the land and encoding their looking in stone. What they were looking at, what they were trying to understand, we do not know exactly. But the fact that they were doing it, the fact that they took the trouble to place heavy carved stones on a headland facing the open ocean, tells you something about the seriousness of their inquiry. Inquiry is the right word for what these structures represent. They are not just monuments to what was already known. They are instruments for continuing to learn. The astronomical alignments are not static records of past knowledge. They are ongoing instruments for observing the sky. Every year, on every solstice and equinox, the shadows fall on the same marks, and the same alignments are visible from the same positions. Every year that observation can be made again, confirming what was known before and potentially revealing something new. The structures are built for continuous use, for continuous inquiry into the patterns of the world. That quality, the quality of ongoing inquiry rather than static commemoration, is one of the things that makes these structures feel different from what they are often compared to in academic literature. They are often compared to Stonehenge, to the megalithic monuments of Neolithic Europe, which is a reasonable comparison in some respects but potentially misleading in others. The European megaliths were built in a specific historical moment and by specific cultures that are now gone, and their main modern significance is historical rather than functional. They are not being actively used by living communities to do the things they were built to do. The Canadian sites are different. Some of them are still actively used by the communities whose ancestors built them for the purposes they were built to serve. The Blackfoot peoples of the Alberta Plains still gather at medicine wheel sites for ceremonies that are connected to the astronomical functions of those sites. The Mi'kmaq still visit the place where the shadows speak. The Haida still regard the Haida Gwaii headland as sacred and still use it in ways that reflect an understanding of its significance that has not been entirely lost. These are not static ruins. They are living sites within living cultures, and that living quality changes the way you should think about them. It means the tradition they represent was not extinguished. It was diminished. It was disrupted. It lost enormous amounts of knowledge, but it was not extinguished. And the knowledge that survived can potentially illuminate the knowledge that was lost, if the conversations between knowledge holders and researchers become sufficiently deep and sufficiently trusting. Those conversations are happening, slowly, unevenly, with all the friction that any conversation across large cultural gaps and historical wounds will have. But they are happening. And what they are producing, bit by bit, is a richer picture of what was here, of who was here, of how long they had been here, and what they had built, and what they had known. The picture is not complete. It will not be complete for a very long time, if it is ever complete. Some of the knowledge is genuinely gone, not because of suppression, but because the chains of transmission that carried it were simply too thoroughly broken. Some of the sites have been too thoroughly destroyed, by construction or by well-meaning but clumsy early archaeological work, or simply by time and erosion. Some of the questions we are asking about this history are, and may remain, unanswerable with the tools we have. But the picture that is emerging, even in its incompleteness, is of a Canada that was not empty, was not simple, was not the wilderness of the colonial imagination, waiting for European civilization to arrive and give it meaning. It was a place that was already full of meaning, already marked and mapped and organized and understood by people who had been here for a very long time and who had spent that time learning, systematically and seriously and with considerable sophistication, how to live in it. The stones are the most visible, surviving evidence of that learning. They stand on the ridges and the headlands and the prairies, patient in their granite stillness, waiting for the question that the Anishinaabe elders and the Haida knowledge keepers and the Mi'kmaq elder who died in 2019 and the retired schoolteacher René Beauchamp and the geologist Harold Doreen have all, in their different ways, already asked. The question is simple. What are these? Who put them here? How long have they been here? The question is simple. The answers are not. But that has never been a reason not to ask. Now we need to talk about the water. Because in Canada, more than almost anywhere else on Earth, understanding the land requires understanding the water first. Canada has more fresh water than any other country, more lakes than all other countries combined, by some estimates. The rivers and lakes and bays and sounds of Canada's interior are not just features of the landscape. They are the landscape. They are how the landscape is organized. They are how it was traversed for thousands of years before roads or railways, and for those who knew how to read them, they were as legible as any road, as organized as any highway system. The waterways were the trade routes. The waterways were the communication routes. The waterways were the corridors along which peoples moved and goods flowed and knowledge spread. And the evidence that those waterways were organized, that the peoples who used them had developed systems for marking and understanding and navigating them that went beyond simple practical knowledge, comes in part from the shores. The shores of Canada's rivers and lakes are where many of the stone structures cluster. Not all of them, but many. The Temagami site is above Lady Evelyn Lake, The Gas Bay sites cluster along the river valleys. The Nova Scotia site is on the Bay of Fundy. The Haida Gwaii site is on the coast. The prairie medicine wheels are often near water sources or elevated positions overlooking river valleys. The pattern suggests that the waterways and the stone markers were parts of the same system, that the stones marked the waterways in some way, noted their confluences, their seasonal conditions, their navigational features. The Great Lakes are themselves an extraordinary system. 5 enormous bodies of fresh water linked by rivers and straits, with a combined surface area of nearly 250,000 square kilometers, draining a watershed that covers much of the upper Midwest of the United States and much of southern Ontario and Quebec. The lakes are big enough to create their own weather systems. They are navigable by large watercraft and have been, we now know, for thousands of years. And the peoples who lived around them and on them knew them with the intimacy of people who depend on a body of water for their lives. The sonar anomalies in the Great Lakes are not, strictly speaking, part of the megalith story as it is usually told, but they belong to the same general territory of questions, the same territory of things that have been noticed and documented and then not fully followed up. There are several locations in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior where sonar surveys have detected organized underwater structures that do not appear to be geological features. The most discussed of these is a site in Lake Michigan, northwest of Traverse Bay, where in 2007 a researcher named Mark Holley was conducting a sonar survey of the lake bottom and encountered what appeared to be a line of stones on the lake floor at a depth of roughly 12 meters, one of which, upon closer examination by a diver, appeared to bear a carving that resembled a mastodon. Mastodons were extinct in the Great Lakes region by approximately 10,000 years ago. Lake Michigan's current level was reached approximately 10,000 years ago as the glaciers retreated and meltwater accumulated. If the stone with the mastodon carving is genuinely a mastodon carving, and if the lake was at a lower level when the carving was made, then the carving was made at a time when that part of the lake bottom was dry land, which means it was made at least 10,000 years ago, possibly more. 10,000 years ago. That is deep time by any standard. It is the beginning of the Holocene, the geological epoch we currently live in. It is the moment when the great ice sheets of the last glaciation were melting and the landscape of North America was taking on roughly its current configuration. People were there. We know people were there, moving through the landscape as the ice retreated, finding new territories, following the animals, settling into the places where the conditions were right for longer stays. Did they carve a mastodon on a rock that is now 12 meters underwater in Lake Michigan? We do not know. The image was not well documented before the discovery became public, and the site was then protected. The carving, if it is a carving, has not been fully analyzed. The context, the arrangement of stones that surrounds it, has not been fully investigated. The site sits underwater, expensive to access, and requiring specialized equipment to study, and the funding for that study has not materialized in the years since the discovery. Another unanswered question on the long list of unanswered questions. Another appendix in another report sitting in another filing cabinet, waiting. There is a researcher in Winnipeg named Brenda Lariviere who has spent 20 years collecting and cross-referencing historical survey data from across the Canadian prairies. She is not an archaeologist. She is a retired civil engineer. She came to this work sideways, through a family connection. Her grandmother was Métis, from a community in the Qu'Appelle Valley of Saskatchewan, and her grandmother used to tell her about a place in the valley where old stones stood in a line and where the sunset on certain days of the year did something extraordinary. Lariviere grew up and became an engineer and lived in Winnipeg and forgot about the stones for 30 years. Then her grandmother died, and she went back to the Qu'Appelle Valley for the funeral, and she walked up to the place her grandmother had described, and the stones were still there, and the sun was in the wrong position to do anything. Extraordinary because it was March and not the solstice. But the stones themselves, the size of them, and the regularity of their spacing and the way their flat faces were oriented, told her something that her engineering background was well equipped to read. These were not random. These had been placed. She went back in June with a surveying instrument she had not used since her last job. She measured the stones and their orientations, and she did some calculations, and what she found was that the stones, if extended as a line, pointed directly toward the position of the sunrise on the summer solstice. She went back to Winnipeg, and she started reading everything she could find about prairie stone structures. She found Freeman's work. She found the historical survey reports. She found the scattered literature of researchers who had documented individual sites over the decades. And she started building a database. The database now contains documented information on over 300 stone structure sites in the 3 prairie provinces. 300. And that is certainly not a complete inventory. It represents the sites that have been formally documented in surveys and reports. The sites that local people know about but that have not been formally documented are probably more numerous. The sites that have been destroyed by agriculture and construction and urban development over the last 150 years of European settlement of the prairies are numerous enough that it is painful to think about. 300 known sites, distributed across the prairies in a pattern that Lariviere's analysis suggests is not random. Not all of the sites are formal medicine wheel structures. Many are simpler, stone cairns, boulder alignments, single standing stones in positions that suggest intentional placement. But when you map them against the landscape, against the river valleys and the ridge lines and the elevation features of the prairie topography, a pattern emerges. They cluster along routes. They cluster at the places where routes intersect or where routes cross significant geographic features. They cluster, in other words, like the markers of a trail system across the prairies. A network of routes, marked by stones at significant intervals, connecting communities across an enormous flat landscape, where getting lost is genuinely possible, and where knowing where you are in relation to the available water and the seasonal resources is genuinely survival critical. The stones mark the routes. The astronomical alignments of the stones provide the calendar. The combination gives you a navigational system for moving safely and efficiently across one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. Lariviere presented her database and her analysis at a conference in Saskatoon in 2019. The presentation was well received by the local archaeologists who attended, several of whom told her afterward that her database was more comprehensive than anything that existed in the academic literature. She was asked if she intended to publish. She said she intended to, once she had done more work on the statistical analysis of the site distribution. The publication has not yet appeared. She is still working on the statistical analysis. She is also dealing with the challenge that publishing a database of 300 sensitive cultural sites, many of them on privately owned land and some of them on land where their presence is not known to the landowners, raises significant ethical questions about access and protection that she does not feel comfortable resolving alone. That ethical complexity, the tension between the value of sharing knowledge and the risk of that knowledge leading to damage or exploitation of the sites themselves, is a recurring theme in this field. The people who care most about these sites are often the most reluctant to publicize them because they have seen what happens when a significant archaeological site becomes publicly known without adequate protection. Looters arrive. Curious people with inadequate respect for fragile features arrive. The sites are disturbed, damaged, diminished. The solution to this tension is not obvious. It involves adequate legal protection for sites before they are publicized, which requires getting the attention of institutions that are often slow to respond. It involves community governance of information about sites, which requires trust between researchers and communities that takes time to build. It involves a cultural shift in how people relate to archaeological sites, from seeing them as interesting things to visit and touch and photograph, to seeing them as fragile and irreplaceable records that deserve the same protection we give to any other kind of irreplaceable document. That cultural shift is happening, slowly. The increasing prominence of Indigenous land rights and Indigenous cultural heritage in Canadian public discourse is part of what is driving it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action include specific provisions about the protection of Indigenous cultural sites. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has endorsed, includes the right of Indigenous peoples to maintain and protect their cultural heritage, including archaeological sites on their traditional territories. These are not just words. They are changing, slowly, the legal and institutional landscape within which these sites exist and within which research on them happens. But slowly is the word. The sites are still being damaged. The highway projects and the pipeline construction and the agricultural activities that disturb them are still happening, sometimes with inadequate archaeological assessment and sometimes with inadequate protection even after assessment. The balance between development and heritage protection is a constant negotiation, and the heritage often loses. What we stand to lose if the heritage loses is not just interesting archaeological data. It is something that is very difficult to put a number on, but that matters enormously. It is the evidence of a deep, sophisticated, continuous human relationship with this land. The evidence that the land was not just physically occupied, but intellectually and spiritually engaged with, over a very long time. by peoples who understood it at a depth that we are only beginning to appreciate. That evidence is not replaceable. Once the stones are gone, they are gone. The knowledge encoded in their placement, the astronomical relationships, the landscape logic, the connections to oral traditions, all of that goes with them. This is why the question of what the Canadian megalith story means is not just an academic question. It is a question about what Canada knows about itself, about what Canada is willing to know about itself, about whether the official story of this country is going to continue to begin with European contact and treat everything that came before as either irrelevant or illegible, or whether it is going to expand to include the full richness of what was here. A richness that the stones themselves make visible, if you are willing to go and look. The willing to go and look part is not as simple as it sounds. It requires a particular quality of attention, a willingness to suspend the assumption that you already know what pre-contact North America looked like and to let the evidence actually tell you. It requires a willingness to sit with uncertainty, to hold the question open rather than forcing it to close before you have enough data. And it requires, perhaps most difficult of all, a willingness to take seriously the accounts of people whose authority to describe their own history has been systematically denied for a very long time. That is the shape of the intellectual work that is needed, and some people are doing it. The researchers we have talked about in this video, and the many more who are out there doing this work in relative obscurity, are doing it. They are going to the sites and taking the measurements and doing the statistical analysis and having the conversations with knowledge holders and writing the papers, even when the papers take years to get published and are then cited once. They are doing it because the question matters, and because the stones are there and because someone has to ask. The Arctic is a part of this story that we have not yet given sufficient attention, and it deserves attention because it contains some of the most extraordinary stone structures in the world and some of the most extraordinary stories about the peoples who made them. The Inuksuk, the stone figure that represents a human form and that has become a kind of symbol of Canada, is the most famous of these structures, but it is only the most famous. The stone-working traditions of the Arctic peoples, the Thule and Dorset cultures, and before them others who moved through those landscapes as the ice allowed, are ancient and varied, and not fully understood. The Dorset culture, which inhabited Arctic Canada and Greenland from roughly 2,700 years ago to about 1,000 years ago, left behind stone structures of considerable sophistication, long houses made of stone slabs. Caches organized with a logic that suggests systematic planning rather than opportunistic storage, and, in several locations, stone alignments and arrangements that have attracted attention from researchers who find them difficult to explain purely in terms of the known Dorset cultural repertoire. One of the most discussed is a site on Baffin Island, on a peninsula that juts into Hudson Strait. The site consists of a series of stone platforms on a hillside, arranged in a staircase-like formation ascending the hill. The platforms are roughly level, constructed from local flat stones, each one large enough for several people to stand on. The arrangement of the platforms follows the contour of the hill in a way that is too regular to be accidental. They form a specific shape, a shape that has a directional logic, pointing toward a notch in the ridge above where, on a clear morning, the sun rises at the equinox. The Baffin Island site was documented by a researcher from Memorial University of Newfoundland in the 1990s. She spent 2 field seasons there, mapping the platforms and the sight lines and the relationships between them. Her conclusion was that the site was a deliberate astronomical observatory designed to allow observation of the equinox sunrise from the platforms, with the hillside staircase allowing observers at different heights to observe the sun at different moments of its rise. It was, she argued, an extraordinarily sophisticated piece of landscape engineering, designed to do something very specific on a very specific morning every 6 months. The response to her work was, predictably, mixed. The astronomical interpretation was accepted by some colleagues and contested by others. The dating of the site, which she placed in the Dorset period, was questioned. The suggestion that the Dorset people had developed an astronomical observatory of this sophistication was difficult for some researchers to accept, given the relatively simple material culture that is usually associated with Dorset archaeological sites. But the platforms are there, the sight lines are there, the equinox sunrise falls exactly where the site is oriented to observe it. Those are facts. The interpretation of those facts as the product of deliberate astronomical knowledge is a reasonable interpretation. It is not the only possible interpretation, but it is the one that accounts for all the evidence without inventing anything. The Thule culture, which replaced the Dorset throughout the Arctic roughly 1,000 years ago, and which gave rise to modern Inuit cultures, is better documented than the Dorset. And its stone working traditions are formidable. The Karmaks, the stone houses built by Thule and early Inuit communities, are engineering achievements of genuine sophistication. Built to survive Arctic winters that can reach -50 degrees Celsius, they exploit the insulating properties of stone and earth and snow with a precision that has been studied by modern architects interested in passive thermal design. They are not primitive shelters. They are precision instruments for maintaining human life in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The knowledge encoded in a well-built Karmak is extensive. Knowledge of the thermal properties of different stone types. Knowledge of prevailing wind directions and how to orient an entrance to minimize wind intrusion while maintaining ventilation. Knowledge of the thermal layering of air inside a closed space and how to exploit it to maintain warmth near the sleeping platform while colder air pools lower. Knowledge of the structural properties of corbelled stone construction, the way to stack stones so that each course projects slightly over the one below it until the two sides of a wall meet in the middle, creating a self-supporting arch without the need for a keystone. Corbelling is not a simple technique. It requires a sophisticated understanding of where the center of gravity of a stone lies and how much overhang a given course can bear without collapsing. It was used in Neolithic Europe for the construction of burial chambers, most famously at Newgrange in Ireland, which was built approximately 5,000 years ago. It appears in the stone structures of the Peruvian Andes. And it appears in the Arctic Karmak tradition of the Thule culture, developed apparently independently, as a solution to the same problem of creating a structurally stable enclosed space without available timber. The parallel development of corbelling in cultures separated by an ocean and without apparent contact is one of those things that can be interpreted in two ways. It can be interpreted as a demonstration that human beings facing similar problems tend to develop similar solutions, that there is nothing remarkable about corbelling appearing in multiple cultural traditions because it is simply the logical solution to a particular structural challenge. Or it can be interpreted as evidence of a deeper connection, of knowledge moving across the world through contacts that we have not yet documented, of a global tradition of stone working that shares underlying principles across cultures that the official history of human migration and contact does not easily account for. Both interpretations are legitimate. The truth is probably somewhere between them, as the truth usually is. Some structural techniques are genuinely rediscovered independently because they are the logical solution to universal problems. Other similarities between distant cultures reflect contact and the movement of knowledge across distances. Distinguishing between them requires careful attention to chronology, to who was where when, to the specific technical details of execution that can distinguish genuine parallel development from transmission. This is why the dating of the Canadian sites matters so much. If these structures are older than the accepted chronology of North American migration would suggest, then the interpretation space changes. If they are very old, comparable in age to the earliest megalithic structures elsewhere in the world, then the question of isolated development versus connected tradition becomes much more pressing. The question of how old is one that modern technology is increasingly able to address with greater precision. Optical luminescence dating, which measures the last time quartz grains in sediment were exposed to sunlight, has been transformative for the dating of sites where organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating is absent. Cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measures the accumulation of isotopes in rock surfaces exposed to cosmic radiation, can date when a rock surface was first exposed. These techniques, applied carefully to well-preserved sites, are producing dates that are pushing the chronology of North American human activity steadily further back. The evidence for pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas has been accumulating for decades and is now substantial enough that it is no longer a minority position in the archaeological literature. There were people in South America at least 15,000 years ago, before the ice-free corridor through Canada that is usually invoked as the route for the Clovis people was open, which means there were routes of entry to the Americas other than the one that has been the focus of the conventional narrative. The Pacific coastal route, following the coastline by small watercraft from Beringia southward, is now widely accepted as a viable and probably used route of entry. If people were moving along the Pacific coast 15,000 years ago or more, they were moving past what is now British Columbia. They were on or near the coast that includes the Haida Gwaii archipelago. They were in a position to do what people do when they find a suitable headland above a clear ocean horizon. Stand there, look out, ask questions about what lies beyond, perhaps carve something into the rocks, The question of the first Canadians, in the deep sense of who was the first person to stand on Canadian soil, and how long ago, and by what route they arrived, is a question that is being actively revised by research that is moving quickly. The dates keep getting older. The routes keep getting more complicated. The picture of a single migration at a fixed moment in the past keeps giving way to a picture of multiple migrations, multiple routes, long periods of back and forth movement, a much more dynamic and complex story of how this continent came to be inhabited. And within that more complex story, the Canadian megaliths make more sense. They make more sense as the works of peoples who had been here long enough to develop sophisticated knowledge of the landscape, long enough to build traditions of stoneworking that had time to reach a high level of complexity, long enough to create a network of sites that spans a continent and reflects a shared set of underlying principles about how to engage with landscape and sky. The Newfoundland connection to this story deserves its own careful attention. Newfoundland is where the Norse presence in North America is definitively documented, at Lanzo Meadows, but is also where a much older human presence is documented. The maritime archaic tradition, which flourished in Newfoundland and Labrador and the maritime provinces from approximately 9,000 to about 3,500 years ago, produced some of the most remarkable burial sites in the Americas. At Port O'Shoy, on Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula, maritime archaic burials have been found with grave goods that speak to a level of ceremonial sophistication and to a cosmology of some complexity. The maritime archaic people were accomplished maritime hunters. They pursued seals and walrus and possibly whales in the waters of the Labrador Sea. They worked bone and antler and red ochre into objects of considerable elegance. They buried their dead in ways that suggest careful, deliberate engagement with the idea of what happens after death. And they almost certainly worked stone in ways that we have not yet fully documented, because the evidence for their stone structures, if they made them, would tend to be along coastlines that have in many cases been submerged by the rising sea levels of the past 8,000 to 9,000 years. The submerged coastline problem is one of the most significant obstacles to understanding the earliest human presence in Canada and along all of North America's coasts. At the peak of the last glaciation, sea levels worldwide were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. As the glaciers melted, the seas rose, gradually but continuously, and the coastlines of that earlier world moved steadily inland. Everything that was built or lived in or marked on those older coastlines is now underwater, and underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult and limited in what it can find. But it is finding things. At several locations along the Pacific coast of British Columbia, diving archaeologists have found submerged middens, accumulations of shell and bone that are the signature of long-term coastal habitation at depths that put them below the sea level of 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. These middens demonstrate that people were living on the coast of what is now British Columbia at least 9,000 years ago, and the distribution of the submerged sites suggests a continuous coastal occupation stretching back at least that far. 9,000 years of continuous coastal occupation, most of it invisible because it is now underwater. The Haida oral traditions speak of a time when the land was different, when the sea was lower, and the islands of the archipelago were joined, or nearly joined, and the landscape had a configuration that does not correspond to what it is now. The traditions describe this time as ancient but not unknowably ancient. They describe it as the time before the Great Change, the time when the world was arranged differently and when the ancestors lived and worked in that different arrangement. Modern paleogeography is consistent with the broad outlines of this oral account. The land was different, the sea was lower. The configuration of the archipelago has changed significantly over the past 10,000 years as the sea has risen. The Haida people, or their ancestors, witnessed that change. They watched the sea rise and the coastal land disappear and the landscape reorganize itself around them. That is an extraordinary thing to have witnessed, and it is not surprising that it left a mark on the oral tradition. What is surprising, or would have been surprising to people who did not take oral tradition seriously, is that the mark is still legible 10,000 years later. 10,000 years. Let that sit for a moment. A chain of oral transmission, person to person, generation to generation, preserving accurate information about the shape of the coastline and the level of the sea across a span of time longer than the entirety of recorded human history. That is a cognitive and cultural achievement of the first order. It is a demonstration that human beings are capable of things that the dominant culture tends to underestimate when those things are accomplished by cultures it has historically dismissed. The underestimation of indigenous cognitive and cultural capacity is one of the deepest and most consequential errors in the intellectual history of colonialism. It was not an accident. It served specific purposes. If you needed to justify taking people's land, you needed to believe that they were not fully capable of the kind of rational, organized, knowledge-producing activity that justified land ownership under European legal traditions. If you needed to justify your civilizational project, you needed to believe that the people you were civilizing were genuinely uncivilized. The underestimation was built into the justification for the whole enterprise, but the stones do not care about the justification for the enterprise. The stones were placed by people who knew what they were doing. The knowledge that went into their placement was not primitive knowledge. It was astronomical knowledge, navigational knowledge, engineering knowledge, organizational knowledge, all applied with precision and preserved across time with extraordinary durability. That is not the work of people who did not understand the world. It is the work of people who understood it very well. Understanding that is not just an intellectual correction to a historical error. It changes the way you relate to the landscape you are in. If you live in Canada, if you walk across the Canadian Shield, or drive through the prairie provinces, or stand on a Pacific coast headland, the knowledge that the land has been understood and engaged with and marked with human intention for a very long time changes the quality of your experience of it. The land is not empty, even where it looks empty. It is layered. It has a depth that goes back further than the stories we have been telling about it. That layering is what the stones make visible. Each stone on its ridge or on its headland or in its line on a prairie is a marker of depth, not just the depth of time, the 10,000 years and the 7,000 years and the 5,000 years, but the depth of human presence, of sustained attention, of knowledge that was built up over generations and encoded in the landscape itself. The stones are a text that has been waiting to be read. The people who are reading it now, the archaeologists and the indigenous knowledge holders and the retired engineers and the chemistry professors who did not start out interested in this but could not look away once they found it, are doing something important. They are participating in a process of recovery. Not recovery of a lost civilization in the dramatic sense that word is sometimes used, but recovery of an accurate story, recovery of the truth of what happened here, and who was here, and how long ago, and what they were capable of. That recovery is necessarily partial. Some things are simply gone, damaged beyond retrieval by time or construction, or the disruptions of the colonial period. But what remains is remarkable. The stones remain. The oral traditions remain, in attenuated form, but still living. The landscape itself remains, still organized by the logic that the people who inhabited it over thousands of years imposed on it, still legible if you know how to read it. The reading is getting better. The tools are getting better. The technologies and the methodologies and the collaborative relationships between different knowledge systems. And the appetite for the true story is growing. People are tired of the simplified version. People are ready for the complicated version, the one that renders Canada as a place with a deep human history, a history that goes back 10 times further than the official story acknowledges, and that was built by peoples of extraordinary intelligence and sophistication. The complicated version is harder to tell. It has more uncertainty in it. It requires more qualification and more acknowledgement of what we do not know, but it is more honest and more interesting and more respectful of the reality of what happened here, and it is the version the stones support. There are things happening right now in the world of Canadian archaeology and Indigenous heritage that suggest the tide is turning. Not dramatically, not all at once, not without the resistance that any significant revision of an established story encounters, but turning. In 2021, the Government of Canada announced a significant expansion of funding for archaeological heritage protection and for collaborative research programs between academic institutions and Indigenous communities. The announcement came in the wake of the confirmed discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at former residential school sites, a discovery that sharpened the country's sense of the ways in which Indigenous history had been hidden and suppressed. The funding is not sufficient for everything that needs to be done. Funding for this kind of work is never sufficient, but it is more than there was before. In British Columbia, a consortium of First Nations has formed to coordinate the management of archaeological heritage on their traditional territories. The consortium includes communities from the coast, the interior, and the north, and its mandate includes both the protection of known sites and the systematic survey of areas that have not been archaeologically assessed. This kind of coordinated, community-led approach to heritage management is new. It is the result of decades of advocacy by Indigenous communities and their allies, and it represents a genuine shift in who controls the story of what happened on these lands before European contact. In Quebec, Sylvie Tremblay's work on the Gaspé sites has finally attracted the attention of the National Heritage Bureaucracy. A formal survey of the sites she documented is being planned, with participation from Mi'kmaq community representatives who have their own knowledge of the area. The survey may produce radiocarbon dates for some of the sites. It may produce evidence of additional sites in areas between the ones Beauchamp documented. It may, in short, begin to answer some of the questions that have been sitting unanswered since Beauchamp sent his report to Université Laval in the 1990s. In Saskatchewan, Brenda Laraviere's database has been shared with the Provincial Heritage Office and is being used to inform the archaeological assessment requirements for development projects in the Prairie region. 300 sites, or the records of 300 sites, are now in the hands of people who have the authority and the resources to protect them. Not all of them will be protected. Development pressure is strong and heritage protection is never absolute, but some of them will be protected that would not have been without Laraviere's 20 years of obsessive database building. These are not dramatic developments. They are not the announcement of a revolutionary discovery that rewrites everything. They are the slow, grinding progress of evidence accumulating and institutions responding and people doing the work that needs to be done to move knowledge forward. It is not the kind of progress that gets dramatic news coverage, but it is the kind of progress that, over time, changes what we know and what we say and what we teach and how we understand ourselves and the land we live on. Canada is a country that is, slowly and with difficulty and not without backsliding and resistance, coming to terms with its history, all of its history, including the deep history that predates European contact. The stone structures are part of that reckoning. They are evidence of what was here. They are evidence of what was suppressed and overlooked and set aside. And they are evidence, also, of what has endured. Of what continues to endure in the stones themselves and in the oral traditions and in the practices of communities that maintained their connection to these sites through everything that was done to break that connection. There is a word in the Anishinaabe language, Minobimatisiawin, that is sometimes translated as the good life, but which carries a deeper meaning than that simple translation conveys. It refers to a way of living that is in good relationship with the land, with the community, with the cosmos. A way of living that acknowledges the interconnections between things and acts with awareness of them. A way of living in which the astronomical knowledge encoded in the stone structures is not an academic curiosity, but a practical guide to right action, to being in the world in a way that sustains rather than depletes. The people who built the Canadian megaliths were, in their way, practicing Minobimatisiawin. They were encoding the knowledge needed for a good life in a durable form that could survive their own individual lives and be transmitted to the people who came after. They were thinking about the future, the long future, the future that was further away than they could personally see. They were making something for people they would never meet. That is a profound act. It is an act of faith in the continuity of human life and human knowledge. It is an act of generosity toward the future, and the future, which is us, is only now beginning to understand what was left for it. Let us go back to Harold Doreen for a moment, the geologist who found the 11 stones on the ridge northeast of Lady Evelyn Lake in the summer of 1971. He was 53 years old that summer. He had been walking the Canadian Shield for 20 years. He was a man who dealt in facts, in the measurable properties of rock, in magnetometer readings and core samples, and the precise language of geological survey. When he found those stones, he stopped. He measured them. He took photographs. He wrote anomalous in his field notes, and then he went home and reported what he had found, as accurately as he could, in language that was careful and qualified, and that acknowledged the limits of his expertise. He retired in 1983. He died in 1998 at the age of 80. He never went back to the ridge. He never knew that Catherine Morell had found his appendix and visited his site. He never knew about the cup and ring marks she found on the stones. He never knew that the site was still undated, still unexcavated, still unanswered. What he knew was what he had seen in July of 1971. 11 stones on a ridge, spaced at intervals of 1.7 meters, their faces flattened in a way that weathering alone does not produce. Facing north in a line that ran north to south, in a place where no natural process would have arranged them that way. He knew what he had seen, and he did what a careful, honest, responsible person does when they see something they cannot explain. He wrote it down. He included it in his report. He hoped someone with more expertise than he had would follow up. The follow-up took 14 years to begin and has not yet been completed. But the record was there. The record survived. And the record is what allowed Catherine Morell to find her way to that ridge 40 years after Doreen stood there, with his measuring tape and his field journal and his asterisk and his single word, anomalous. That word is a kind of heroism, in its small way, anomalous. A word that says, this does not fit the pattern. This does not match what I expected. I do not know what this is, but I am going to say so rather than pretend it fits or ignore it. That word, in that appendix, in that misfiled folder, was enough. Enough to survive, enough to be found, enough to start a chain of inquiry that is still going. The stones on the ridge do not know about Harold Doreen. They predate him by however many thousands of years. They predate the written language that he used to describe them. They predate the geological terminology that informed his perception of them. They predate almost everything except the land they stand on and the sky they stand under. But he is part of their story now. He is part of the chain of attention that connects the people who place those stones to the people who are still trying to understand them. A chain of attention that has links of very different lengths and materials. The long, smooth links of geological time, the shorter, rougher links of human cultural transmission, the very short link of a field journal entry made by a geologist who was not supposed to be doing archaeology and who did his best with what he had. The Canadian megalith story is full of these links. People who are not archaeologists finding things that archaeologists should have found. People who are not part of the academic institution paying attention in ways the academic institution was not paying attention. A retired school teacher in the Gaspé Peninsula, a remote sensing specialist in a satellite imagery analysis facility, a retired civil engineer in Winnipeg, a geologist on a mineral survey in the Temagami wilderness. They found the things they found because they were paying attention to the world around them and because they were honest enough to say what they saw. That quality, the quality of honest attention, is what drives knowledge forward. Not just in archaeology. In everything, the willingness to stop and look at something that does not fit and say, this is here, I see this. I do not know what it means, but it is real, and it is here, and someone should look at it more carefully. Honest attention is what the stones deserve. They have been waiting, in some cases, for a very long time, for someone to pay them the kind of attention they are due, the kind of attention that takes their existence seriously, that brings the best available analytical tools to bear on understanding them, that seeks out the knowledge that Indigenous communities have maintained about them, and takes that knowledge seriously as evidence. The kind of attention that is willing to revise its conclusions when new evidence arrives, and that is patient enough to do the work carefully rather than rushing to a dramatic conclusion. The conclusions, when they come, are likely to be complex. The history of human occupation of Canada before European contact is not going to resolve into a simple story, even after decades more of research. It is going to resolve into a complicated story, a story with many threads and many uncertainties, and many places where the evidence simply does not allow us to say for certain what happened. That is the nature of deep history. That is the nature of a past that was mostly not written down, that survived only in stone and in oral tradition and in the genetic signatures of the descendants of the people who lived it. But complex is better than simple when simple is wrong, and the simple story that Canada's deep history was essentially empty, essentially primitive, essentially without the kinds of sophistication and organization and achievement that deserve to be called civilizational, is wrong. The stones say it is wrong. The oral traditions say it is wrong. The growing body of genetic and archaeological research says it is wrong. The complicated story is the true story. And the complicated story is, in its own way, more beautiful than the simple story, because it renders the land as something more than a backdrop. It renders the Canadian Shield and the prairie grasslands and the Pacific coast and the Arctic as places where human intelligence has been at work for a very long time, asking questions, finding answers, encoding knowledge in forms durable enough to survive, building a relationship with the land that is richer and deeper and more textured than the official narrative has ever managed to convey. You are probably half asleep by now, or maybe more than half. The room is probably quiet. Whatever light there was has probably been reduced to nothing or almost nothing, and the words are probably washing over you without demanding that you hold on to them, which is exactly right. Let them wash. Let this story move through you without holding on. The stones will still be there when you are finished sleeping. They will be there tomorrow and the day after, and the year after, and the decade after. They have been there for a very long time already. They are not going anywhere. What will change is the understanding of them. What will change, slowly and imperfectly but genuinely, is how Canada sees itself and its past. What will change is the official story, the one that gets taught in schools and repeated in documentaries and embedded in the national self-image. It will change because the evidence demands that it change, and because the people who have always known the truth have been saying so long enough and loudly enough that the institutions are beginning to hear them. That is a slow revolution. But revolutions in understanding are usually slow. They happen at the pace of evidence accumulating and conversations deepening, and the patience of the evidence finally wearing down the resistance of the institutions. They happen at the pace of a retired schoolteacher spending 6 years walking the forests of the Gaspé Peninsula and writing down everything he sees. At the pace of a geologist writing anomalous in a field journal and hoping someone follows up. At the pace of an elder telling her granddaughter about a place where old stones stand in a line and the sunset does something extraordinary. The pace of a very long story being told, one voice at a time, across a very long time. We have been talking for a while now about specific sites and specific researchers and specific discoveries. But there is a larger question underneath all of these specific things, a question about what all of this, collectively, means for how we understand what Canada is, not just archaeologically, but philosophically, culturally, as a place and as a political entity and as a human story. Canada as a political entity is young. It became a country in 1867. The British presence in what is now Canada goes back a few hundred years. The French presence goes back a few hundred years more. The Norse presence at Lansell Meadows goes back 1,000 years. But the human presence in Canada goes back at least 15,000 years, and possibly more. The country that has existed for 150 years is sitting on top of a history that is 100 times longer. Most countries, most established societies, know this about themselves. They know that the landscape they inhabit has been shaped by human presence going much further back than the particular political entity that now claims it. The Italians know that Rome was built over earlier settlements going back thousands of years. The Chinese know that the civilization they inhabit has roots that reach back 5,000 or 6,000 years. Even the Americans, whose national mythology is so oriented toward a beginning, know at some level that there was something before the Declaration of Independence. But Canada has been particularly slow to integrate its deep history into its national self-understanding, partly because the colonization of Canada was so thorough and so devastating to Indigenous peoples that the connections between the deep past and the present were so badly damaged. Partly because Canadian national identity is itself a somewhat uncertain provisional thing that has historically been defined more by what it is not than by what it is. Not American, not British, not French, just Canadian. That negative definition leaves a lot of space that the deep history could fill, if Canada were willing to let it. The megaliths are part of an invitation to let it. They are an invitation to expand the Canadian story backward in time, to let the deep history of this land become part of what Canada understands itself to be the current occupant of, not as a comfortable myth of continuity, not as a denial of the rupture that colonization caused, but as an honest acknowledgement that the land has a history that is richer and longer and more important than the political story usually acknowledges. That acknowledgement is not just academic, it has practical consequences. If you understand that the land you are walking on was organized and understood and marked with human purpose for thousands of years before your particular cultural tradition arrived, it changes your relationship to it. It becomes harder to treat the land as simply a resource to be extracted. It becomes harder to treat the indigenous communities that have maintained their connection to that land as simply supplicants for government benefits. It becomes easier to take seriously the knowledge systems that developed over those thousands of years and that have things to say about how to inhabit this particular landscape sustainably. The environmental knowledge encoded in the stone calendar systems of the prairies is not just historically interesting, it is practically relevant to people who still need to know when to plant and when to harvest, and when the weather patterns shift, and when the seasons turn. The astronomical knowledge embedded in the coastal observatory sites is not just a curiosity about what ancient peoples found interesting. It is an example of a cognitive relationship to the natural world that took thousands of years to develop and that is not easily replicated from scratch. We are at a moment in the history of this continent and this planet when the question of how to inhabit a landscape sustainably is the most important question there is. And the peoples who have been inhabiting the landscapes of North America for 15,000 years have things to say about that question. Not all of their knowledge is directly applicable to contemporary problems, because the world has changed enormously. But the underlying orientation, the disposition toward the land as something to be understood and respected and maintained rather than simply consumed, is directly applicable. It is exactly the orientation that sustainable habitation requires. The stones are part of this. They are monuments to a particular orientation toward the world, an orientation that is patient, that thinks on long time scales, that encodes knowledge in durable forms, because it assumes that the knowledge will be needed by people far in the future. That treats the relationship between human beings and the land and the sky as something that requires ongoing attention and care and intelligence. That orientation is what we need, and it is available to us in the stones that are still standing and in the traditions that are still living and in the conversations that are increasingly happening between people who have maintained that orientation and people who are looking for it. The stones are the invitation. The question is whether we are willing to accept. The nights in Canada are extraordinarily dark in the places where these stones stand. The places remote enough from city light to allow the full sky to be visible are places where the sky is genuinely shocking in its depth and brightness. The Milky Way as a physical object, as a band of actual starlight dense enough to cast a faint shadow on a clear, moonless night. The planets moving in their predictable paths across the ecliptic. The circumpolar stars wheeling around Polaris in their stately rotation. The occasional dramatic intrusion of an aurora, green and white and sometimes red, filling the northern sky with shifting curtains of colour. The people who built the stone structures watched this sky. They watched it not casually, not as tourists, but with the intensity of people for whom the sky was a practical tool. The position of the sun on the horizon at dawn told them where they were in the year. The position of the moon told them about the tides, about the conditions for travel on the water, about the approach of particular seasonal phenomena. The positions of certain stars told them about the approach of certain winds, certain temperatures, certain changes in the availability of food. They watched the sky the way a modern person reads a clock or a calendar or a weather forecast. With attention, with expectation, with the orientation of a person who needs specific information from what they are looking at. And they encoded what they learnt in the stones so that the information would still be available on nights when the specific people who carried it in their heads were gone. The stones are, among other things, a form of insurance, a way of ensuring that the knowledge survived even if the individual knower did not, a way of distributing the knowledge across the landscape so that it was available wherever you were, rather than only where the knowledgeable person happened to be standing, a way of making the knowledge public, accessible to anyone who had learned how to read it, rather than keeping it concentrated in the hands of specialists. That democratization of knowledge is itself significant. It suggests a particular kind of social organization, one in which important practical knowledge is not hoarded by a priestly class or a specialist guild, but is encoded in the landscape in ways that allow any member of the community to access it. Every person who knew how to read the stones was carrying a navigational and calendrical resource that was as accurate as the stones themselves. Every person who understood the relationship between the stone markers and the sky could orient themselves in time and space with a precision that would have been remarkable in the absence of writing or mechanical timekeeping. That is a kind of literacy. Stone literacy, sky literacy, landscape literacy. The ability to read the world around you as a text. It is a literacy that took generations to develop and that was transmitted across generations through exactly the kind of patient, careful, long-duration process that created the stones in the first place. And it is a literacy that was very nearly lost, that survives only in attenuated form in the communities that maintained it through everything that was thrown at them. The survival of any fragment of that literacy is remarkable. It speaks to the robustness of human cultural transmission even under conditions of extreme disruption. And it speaks to the quality of the knowledge itself, to the fact that it was worth maintaining, that the people who carried it understood its value and passed it on, even when doing so was dangerous or difficult or simply exhausting. The elders who maintained these traditions were doing something heroic, not in the dramatic sense of facing a battlefield. In the quieter, a more durable sense of insisting on the importance of what they knew and transmitting it to the people who would come after them, even when the institutions around them were systematically trying to prevent them from doing so. The residential school system was specifically designed to break exactly this kind of intergenerational cultural transmission. It did not fully succeed. That it did not fully succeed is the result of individual acts of courage and insistence, repeated across generations and across the entire geography of this country. The oral traditions that survive, the knowledge of the stone sites that persists in communities across Canada, are the result of those individual acts. of grandmothers who told their granddaughters about a place where old stones stand in a line and the sunset does something extraordinary, of elders who maintained the language that carried the place names, the names that told you where the old ones had stood, stones on end, and where the shadows spoke, and where the ancient people had built their fires, of people who kept saying what they knew, quietly, persistently, to whoever would listen. We are listening now. Or more of us are listening than were listening before. And what we are hearing, slowly, as the conversations deepen and the research accumulates, and the collaboration between different knowledge systems becomes more genuine, is the true shape of Canada's deep history. The shape of a land that was fully inhabited, fully understood, fully marked with human intelligence for a very long time before European contact. The stones mark that shape. The stones are the most visible surviving evidence of a human engagement with this land that was as sophisticated and as serious as any engagement we know of anywhere in the world, and they deserve, finally, to be taken seriously. The question of whether Canada's megaliths are connected to the megalithic traditions of the Old World, whether the cup and ring marks on the Temagami stones have any relationship to the cup and ring marks on the Neolithic standing stones of Scotland and Ireland, is one that serious researchers approach with considerable caution. The caution is warranted. The history of transatlantic contact theories is full of examples of people who saw formal similarities between cultures and jumped to conclusions about cultural connection that the evidence did not support. The diffusionist movement of the early 20th century went badly wrong in exactly this way, constructing elaborate theories of cultural connection based on superficial formal similarities and discrediting the field of transcultural comparison for generations. But the caution should not be absolute. The question of whether there was meaningful transatlantic contact before Columbus is not closed. The Norse presence at L'Anse aux Meadows proves that pre-Columbian transatlantic contact was possible and did occur. The genetic evidence for contact between Western Eurasian populations and certain North American populations, which has been detected in a handful of studies using different methodologies, suggests the possibility of contact that predates the Norse and that the scientific community has not yet agreed on how to interpret. The specific similarities that researchers have noted between North American and European megalithic traditions are more detailed than the simple presence of carved stones or stone circles. They involve specific formal elements, specific astronomical orientations, specific relationships between structures and landscape that go beyond what would be expected from independent parallel development. The cup and ring mark tradition in particular is worth examining carefully because it is a very specific and distinctive cultural practice that appears in a very specific geographic distribution, in Atlantic Europe from Iberia to Scotland to Scandinavia, and in scattered locations across North America, concentrated on the eastern seaboard and in the Great Lakes region. Whether that distribution reflects cultural connection or independent development in separate but perhaps related cultural traditions is a genuinely open question. It is the kind of question that requires more data than we currently have to answer with confidence. But it is not a question that should be dismissed simply because it makes people uncomfortable, or because it has been asked badly in the past by people with agendas, or because the institutions that should be investigating it have not found the resources or the will to do so. It deserves serious investigation. The kind of investigation that brings together specialists in North American archaeology, specialists in Atlantic European Neolithic archaeology, specialists in maritime history and navigation, and specialists in the genetic and linguistic evidence for pre-Columbian contact, and asks them to look at the evidence together with the question genuinely open. That investigation is not happening yet, at least not in any coordinated or well-funded way, but the groundwork for it is being laid. The individual pieces of evidence are being documented. The conversations between researchers in different fields are beginning to happen. The institutional resistance to the question, while still strong, is weaker than it was. When the investigation does happen in a serious way, it will produce results that are probably not as dramatic as the most ambitious transatlantic contact theories suggest, and not as dismissive as the most conservative academic positions insist. The truth is usually somewhere more complicated than either the exciting version or the boring version. But even the complicated version, the version that acknowledges some connection while being honest about the uncertainty and the limits of the evidence, will change the picture significantly. It will change the picture because it will embed the Canadian stones in a larger tradition, not just a continental tradition, not just a North American tradition, but potentially a global tradition, a human tradition of engaging with stone and sky and landscape in ways that produce similar forms across very different cultures, because the questions being asked are similar, because the cosmos being observed is the same cosmos, because the human drive to understand and mark and preserve is universal. That universality is not surprising, but it is profound. The stones of Temagami, and the stones of Callanish in Scotland, and the stones of the Carnac alignments in Brittany, and the stones of Majorville in Alberta are products of the same fundamental human impulse. The impulse to understand the world, to mark your understanding, to share your understanding across time, to leave something that will still be speaking when you are gone. They are all, in this sense, the same kind of act, separated by ocean and by millennia, and by cultural traditions that are profoundly different in their specifics, but that share, at the deepest level, the same orientation toward the world. The orientation that says, the universe has patterns, and human beings can understand them, and it is worth the effort of encoding that understanding in something that will last. That orientation is what makes us human. It is the orientation that produced every tradition of inquiry, every technology, every art form, every system of knowledge that the species has ever developed. The Canadian megaliths are an expression of it. They are a local, specific, particular expression of it, embedded in a specific landscape and a specific cultural history and a specific way of relating to the land. But they are also an expression of something that is not local or specific or particular, something that is as old as consciousness itself. The old ones who stood stones on end, on a ridge in northern Ontario, were doing what conscious beings do. They were paying attention to the world and asking what it meant and trying to leave something that would still be speaking after they were gone, and it is still speaking. After 7,000 years or 5,000 years or however many years it has been, it is still there, on the ridge, aligned to the sky, waiting. There is something that happens when you stand at one of these sites for long enough. When you have stopped thinking about the academic debates and the funding shortfalls and the institutional inertia and the questions that remain unanswered, when you have just been standing there, with the stones and the wind and the sky, for long enough that the human noise in your head has started to quiet down, what happens is a quality of presence that is hard to describe, a sense of scale, of course. The usual sense of scale that comes from encountering anything very old, but also something else, something less usual, a sense of being addressed, not in words. The stones do not speak in words, but the arrangement of them, the deliberateness of their placement, the precision of their orientation, says something. It says, we were here. We knew things. We wanted you to know that we knew. We were here. We knew things. We wanted you to know. That is the message in the stones. Simple and enormous, and available to anyone who goes to the right ridge and stands there long enough. The right ridge is not easy to find. Some of the sites are on private land. Some are in remote wilderness accessible only by floatplane or long portage. Some are known only to local communities who do not publicize them for reasons of protection or sanctity. But some are accessible for the person who is willing to do the research and make the effort and be respectful about what they are going to visit. And for those who cannot make the physical journey, there is the research literature, growing slowly but surely. There are the oral histories, becoming more accessible as Indigenous communities make decisions about sharing. There are the photographs and the measurements and the descriptions of the people who have been there, Doreen and Morel and Beauchamp and Tremblay and Freeman and Lariviere and all the others. There is, in short, a growing body of work that makes it possible to encounter these sites even from a distance, to understand something of what they are and what they mean, to participate, at least partially, in the reading of the text they contain. Reading that text is the work of a generation or more, the work of researchers and knowledge holders and institutions that are slowly changing and communities that are slowly being heard. It is work that will not be finished in our lifetimes. The stones will still be speaking when we are gone. They will still be there, on their ridges and their headlands and their prairies, aligned to skies that do not change, waiting for the understanding that they have been patient enough to wait for already. There is comfort in that, in the patience of stones, in the way very old things hold their position while everything else moves and changes around them. The world changes, the institutions change, the stories we tell about ourselves change, and the stones stay, doing what they were placed to do, speaking in the only language they know, which is the language of position and alignment and relationship, the language of where and when and what direction and what angle of the morning light. That language is real. It says something real, and more people are learning to hear it. The night is deep now, wherever you are. The sounds of the ordinary world have probably receded to almost nothing. Whatever you are carrying into this listening, whatever concern or preoccupation or half-formed anxiety that was riding behind your eyes when you began this video, has probably loosened its grip somewhat. That is what this kind of deep time does. It loosens the grip of the immediate. It reminds you that the urgency you felt this morning about whatever you felt urgent about is a very small thing in the context of 7,000 years. That most of what feels urgent to us in our individual lives is, from the perspective of a stone that has been standing on a ridge since before the oldest of the world's civilizations began, not urgent at all. That loosening is not nihilism. It is not the message that nothing matters because everything is small compared to 7,000 years. The stones were placed by people for whom things mattered deeply enough to move multi-ton blocks of granite up a steep ridge for reasons that had nothing to do with personal comfort or immediate advantage. They mattered deeply enough to spend years aligning them to celestial events that would only be fully observable on specific mornings decades apart. Deep time did not make things matter less to the people who lived in it. It made certain things matter more. The things that were worth preserving. The things that were worth encoding in stone. The things worth preserving. That phrase keeps coming back as you spend time in this story. What did the builders of the Canadian megaliths think was worth preserving? What did they choose to encode in the most durable medium available to them? In stone, in alignment, in relationship between rock and sky. Calendrical knowledge was one of those things. The astronomical orientations at these sites are too consistent and too precise to be coincidental. Someone thought that the ability to mark the solstices and equinoxes, to know where in the year you were by observing where the sun rose above the horizon, was important enough to encode permanently in heavy granite. That suggests a social organization that needed to coordinate activities across time and across distance. That suggests communities that planned, that anticipated, that needed to synchronize their activities with each other and with the seasonal rhythms of the landscape. Geographic knowledge was another. The distribution of these sites along waterways and at navigational landmarks suggests that they were also serving a function in the organization of movement across the landscape, marking confluences, marking portage points, marking places where particular routes met or diverged. A person traveling through an unknown part of the shield, who knew how to read these markers, would have access to information that was otherwise locked in the heads of local community members. The markers made the knowledge portable. They turned private knowledge into public infrastructure. And there was something else. Something that the astronomical precision and the geographic distribution and the sheer labor invested in these structures all point toward, but that is harder to name. Call it cosmological knowledge. Knowledge about how the world was organized, about the relationship between the human and the natural and the celestial, about the place of human beings in the large ordering of things. The kind of knowledge that every serious human culture has developed, in one form or another, as an answer to the questions that conscious beings cannot help asking. Where are we? Why are we here? How should we live? The Canadian megaliths are answers to those questions, encoded in stone because the answers were considered important enough to preserve in the most durable form available. They are not just practical tools. They are expressions of a cosmology, of a way of understanding the world that was considered important enough to make permanent. And they invite us, across whatever gulf of time separates us from their makers, to ask the same questions and to take the answers seriously. The questions themselves are unchanged. Where are we? Why are we here? How should we live? These are not archaeological questions. They are not historical questions. They are the questions of this moment, your moment, sitting wherever you are in whatever degree of wakefulness or drowsiness you find yourself in, having listened to a story about stones and time and the slow accumulation of knowledge. The stones would have an answer to those questions, if we could read their language fluently. We cannot, not yet. We are still learning the language. But what we can read, even now, with the partial fluency we have managed to develop, is this. You are here, on a land that has been inhabited and known and cared for a very long time. The people who inhabited and knew and cared for it before you were not less than you. They were not simpler or more primitive or less intelligent. They were fully human, fully curious, fully capable of the kind of sophisticated engagement with the world that produced the stones you are only now learning to see. You inherit that land, and you inherit, in some partial and imperfect way, the tradition of paying attention to it, of taking it seriously, of understanding that it has a history that goes back further than you can personally remember and that will continue forward further than you can personally anticipate. of understanding that your moment in it is one link in a very long chain, and that the quality of that link, the degree of care and attention and intelligence you bring to your time in this place, matters to the chain as a whole. The people who placed the stones at Temagami thought about the chain. They thought about the people who would come after them, who would need the knowledge they were encoding, who would stand on the same ridge and watch the same sunrise over the same horizon and need to know what they were seeing. They thought forward across time in a way that we tend not to do, or not to do with the same seriousness. They thought about their responsibility to people they would never meet. That responsibility is part of what the stones are saying, if we can hear it. Not just what do you know, but what are you doing with what you know? Not just what has been here, but what will you leave that will still be speaking after you are gone? Those are big questions for the tail end of a long video, too big to answer here, in this drowsy, half-dreaming space. But big questions do not need to be answered immediately. They need to be held. They need to be carried around for a while, turned over, returned to, asked again from a different angle. They need the kind of patient attention that the people who placed the stones gave to the sky, season after season, year after year, until they understood what they were looking at well enough to encode it in granite. Carry the question. Let it rest in you the way the stones rest on their ridge. Still, patient, aligned to something true. The darkness outside is probably complete now, or very close. The thoughts that were active when you started this have probably settled into something softer, something that is more sensation than idea. The weight of time that this story carries tends to do that. It settles things. It reminds the nervous system that most of what it considers urgent is not, in the long view, urgent at all. That most of what seems large is small. And most of what seems small, the moment on the ridge when the shadow falls exactly where it was designed to fall, the sound of a particular word in a particular language, describing a particular place where stones stand in a line, is larger than it appears. The Mi'kmaq elder said that stone does not forget. That is a truth that carries further than its context. The landscape holds what happens in it. The rocks of the Canadian Shield have been holding things for 4 billion years. The memories of the planet are encoded in its surface, in its strata, in the marks that forces beyond human scale have left on it. And laid over those geological memories, thin but distinct, are the human memories. The stones that were placed on particular ridges to mark particular knowledge, the cup and ring marks that were pecked into particular surfaces for particular reasons, the cairns and alignments and circles and platforms that people built on particular headlands and in particular meadows because those places meant something to them and they wanted the meaning to outlast them. The meaning outlasted them by how much we are still learning. But the stones are still there, the meaning is still there, and we are here, in the middle of the night, listening to a long story about time and stone and the patience of both, receiving, in whatever partial and distorted way this medium allows, some fragment of what was placed in those stones for exactly this purpose, for the purpose of being received by someone, sometime, when the knowledge was needed. Maybe it is needed now, maybe not in the exact form that the builders of the Temagami stones intended, but, in some form, in the form of a reminder that human beings have been serious about understanding the world for a very long time, that the land we inhabit is not neutral background but a layered text, written in multiple hands across multiple millennia, that the peoples who inhabited it before the story we were taught begins were not simple or absent, but were present and sophisticated and worth knowing about. That reminder is worth carrying into sleep, into the dreams that sort through the day's experience and set the new learning in place. Let this be something that gets sorted and set. Let the stones stand in the dream the way they stand on the ridge. 11 of them, spaced at intervals of 1.7 meters, facing north in a line that runs north to south. Their faces flattened in a way that weathering alone does not produce. Marked on their inner faces, with concentric circles and parallel lines, and a shape that resembles what you would find on a standing stone in Scotland or a boulder in Brittany, waiting for someone to ask what they are. What they are is a question that belongs to everyone, to the Anishinaabe elders who have always known the ridge where the old ones stood stones on end, to the geologist who stopped his bulldozer of the mind and wrote anomalous in his field notes, to the graduate student who found the misfiled appendix and went to the ridge to see for herself, to every researcher and knowledge holder and curious person who has stood in front of something old and felt the pull of a story that did not fit the story they had been told. What they are is an invitation. Come to the ridge. Look at the stones. Watch the sky from where they stand. Pay the kind of attention that the builders of those stones paid to the sky, patient and long duration, and genuinely curious about what you are going to learn. What you will learn is that the world is older and richer and more deeply inhabited by human intelligence than you thought. That the land holds histories you were never told. That the stories are still legible, in the stones and in the sky and in the oral traditions of the people who maintained the thread through everything that was done to cut it. The thread is still there. The stones are still speaking, and the story is still going. There is a section of the Gatineau Hills in Quebec, just north of Ottawa, where the forest comes down to the edge of a lake, so clear that in the right light in early morning you can see the bottom 20 feet below the surface. The lake is fed by springs that come up through the rock, cold and clean, from aquifers that were formed when the last glaciation ended and the meltwater found its way down through the fractured granite. The water has been moving through those fractures for approximately 10,000 years. It is extraordinarily old water, in the sense that the journey it is completing now was begun before human beings had built anything that survived. There are stones at the edge of that lake, not an elaborate site, not a medicine wheel or a solstice observatory or a row of aligned standing stones. Just a collection of granite boulders along the shoreline that are arranged in a way that is slightly too regular to be the work of the glacier alone. They were documented in a 1999 survey by an Algonquin Anishinaabe researcher named Paul Commander, who noted them in passing while conducting a broader survey of traditional land use patterns in the Gatineau watershed. Commander described them as probably a resting place, a known spot on a travel route, possibly marked to indicate the quality of the water or the suitability of the location for a campsite. Probably a resting place, possibly marked. The language of probably and possibly is the honest language of incomplete knowledge. But the possibility it points toward is a human one. Someone stopped here, at this lake, at the edge of this cold, clear water. They found the place suitable. They marked it, in whatever way seemed appropriate to them, with a modest arrangement of stones that would tell the next traveller who came this way that someone had been here before and found the place good. That is a very human act, leaving a mark for the next traveller, saying, in the only language available to you in a place without writing, I was here. The water is good. You can rest. How many resting places like this exist across the Canadian wilderness? How many modest arrangements of stones that are not grand enough to attract archaeological attention but that are nonetheless deliberate, nonetheless meaningful, nonetheless part of the vast unwritten record of human movement and presence across this land? There is no way to count them. There is no survey comprehensive enough to find them all. Many have been destroyed by time and erosion and the accumulating weight of the forest that grows over them and eventually obscures them. Many are known only to local communities. Many are known to no one at all. But the fact that they exist, or that they existed, in numbers that were probably very large, tells you something about the density of human presence on this land. Tells you that the wilderness that the colonial imagination pictured as empty was full of signs, full of marks of passage and markers of good water, and indicators of navigable routes and indicators of places to avoid, full of information, legible to anyone who had grown up learning the language, invisible to anyone who had not. That invisibility was convenient, in a certain historical moment. If you could not see the signs, you could claim the land had no signs. If you could not read the text, you could claim the land had no text. And if the land had no text, if it was truly unmarked and uninscribed by human purpose, then the claim that European arrival was the beginning of history was sustainable. You could tell the story that way, starting from a zero, and no one who had not learned to read the signs would contradict you. But the signs are there. The modest arrangements of stones at the edge of cold lakes, the elaborate stone circles aligned to solstice sunrises on the prairies, the cup and ring marks on granite ridges in Ontario, the stone platforms on hillsides in the Arctic, the carved boulders on headlands in Haida Gwaii, the rows of upright stones in Labrador before the highway took them away, the shapes in the satellite imagery of the Ontario far north that look, to a trained eye, like more than peatland fens. All of it signs, all of it text, all of it saying, in a language that requires patience and humility and a willingness to look closely, that the land was not empty, was not unmarked, was not uninscribed by the long and serious attention of people who had been here a very long time. The resistance to reading these signs is not entirely gone. There are still archaeologists who will tell you that the cup and ring marks are probably natural, that the stone alignments are probably the result of natural processes, that the satellite imagery anomalies are almost certainly patterned fens, These are not unreasonable positions in isolation. Each individual site may genuinely be ambiguous. But when you step back and look at the distribution, when you look at how many sites there are, and how consistently they cluster along routes, and at navigational landmarks, and at astronomically significant positions, the probability of that much consistent ambiguity being random becomes very small. The question of when a pattern is significant enough to be taken seriously is a statistical question as much as an archaeological one. And Brenda Lariviere, who is after all a civil engineer and not without statistical training, has been working on exactly this question for 20 years. Her analysis of the prairie sites suggests that the probability of their distribution being random, given what we know about the topography and the hydrology and the vegetation of the prairie region, is very low. Not zero. Statistical analysis never gives you zero, but low enough that the hypothesis of intentional placement should be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The same kind of analysis applied to the other regional clusters of sites would probably produce similar results. No one has done it yet in a comprehensive way. It is another item on the long list of things that need to be done and have not been done because the resources and the institutional will have not been available. But the methodology exists, the data exists, the analysis is waiting to be done. When it is done, it will produce a body of quantitative evidence that will be much harder for mainstream institutions to dismiss than the qualitative case that has been made so far. Numbers carry a different epistemic weight in modern institutions than descriptions, however precise and careful. When someone shows you that the probability of this distribution being random is less than 1 in 10,000, that is a different kind of statement than saying that the stones look too regular to be natural. It is a statement that demands a response. The response will be, initially, to find methodological objections. There are always methodological objections to statistical analyses of complex systems. The objections will be real ones in some cases and motivated ones in others, and sorting them out will require time and dialogue and probably further research. That is how science works. That is how any collective process of knowledge production works. It is slow and it is often frustrating, but it is, at least in principle, self-correcting. The truth, if it is real, tends to survive the process. The truth of Canada's deep human history is real. The stones are real. The oral traditions are real. The genetic evidence for early and complex human presence in the Americas is real. The convergence of all of these independent lines of evidence toward a picture of sophisticated human activity across a very long time frame is real. The process of science will eventually incorporate this truth into the official record. It is already beginning to. The process is slow, but it is moving. Meanwhile, the stones continue to do what they have always done, which is to stand there and speak in the language of alignment and relationship to anyone who will come and listen. There are seasons to listening to stones. The summer solstice is the most spectacular, when the alignments that are oriented to the solstice sunrise produce their most dramatic effects, when the shadows fall exactly where they were designed to fall, and the light enters the specific spaces that were constructed to receive it. But the equinoxes have their own quality, the sense of balance and transition, of a moment exactly between two states. And the winter, the long, dark Canadian winter, when the stone circles stand above the snow and the aurora moves overhead, has a quality that is harder to describe, and that is perhaps the most powerful of all. In winter, the stones are at their most solitary. The tourist season is long over. The researchers and the curious visitors have gone back to their cities. The land is empty in the way that very cold places are empty, with a stillness that is not the absence of life, but the presence of something larger than individual life. The boreal forest around the stone circles is full of life in winter, full of chickadees and ravens and the tracks of foxes and wolves. But it is quiet life, careful life, life that has learned to hold very still and expend very little energy while the cold lasts. The stones are at home in that winter quiet. They have been standing in it for longer than the forest around them. The individual trees of the boreal forest live for a few hundred years at most, and the forest itself has moved and changed and regenerated many times since the stones were placed. But the stones have stood through all of it. Through the warming after the glaciation and the cooling of the Little Ice Age, and the clearing of the forest and the return of the forest, they have stood through everything, and they are still standing. There is a word for the quality of endurance in the face of change, the quality of remaining what you are while everything around you transforms. In Japanese, there is mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. But the stones are not aware of impermanence, or not in a way that produces sadness. They simply are. They continue. They endure. And in their endurance, they carry the intention that was put into them, the deliberate, thoughtful, sophisticated intention of the people who designed and placed them, across whatever span of time separates their moment from ours. That carrying across time is what monuments are for. That is why human beings build things that are intended to last longer than individual lives, to carry intention across the gap of time, to say to whoever comes next, we were here, we knew things. This is what we knew, this is what we thought was worth preserving. The Canadian megaliths are preserving something about astronomical time and geographic orientation and the relationship between the human and the cosmic. Something about how to inhabit a particular landscape intelligently. Something about what this land is and what it means and how it should be treated. The full content of what they are preserving is not yet recoverable. Too much of the interpretive context has been lost. Too many of the links in the chain of oral transmission have been broken. But the frame is recoverable. The general orientation is recoverable. The fact that someone thought this was worth preserving is recoverable, and that fact is itself important. It says, the knowledge of how to live in this land, with intelligence and care and respect, is not new knowledge. It is very old knowledge. It is knowledge that was considered so important that it was encoded in stone. It is knowledge that deserves to be treated with the same seriousness and the same respect. That knowledge, in its modern form, is what environmental ethics is reaching toward. The understanding that human beings are not the owners of the land but the current inhabitants, with responsibilities to the land itself and to the people who will come after. The understanding that sustainability is not a policy option but a necessity, that a species that depletes the conditions for its own survival is not being rational, whatever it thinks it is doing. The understanding that the long view, the 10,000-year view, the view from the ridge where the stones stand, is the view that eventually matters. The people who placed the stones were thinking on that timescale. They were building for people they would never meet. They were encoding knowledge for situations they could not foresee but assumed would arise. They were practicing a form of intergenerational responsibility that modern societies talk about but rarely demonstrate in their actions. The stones are the demonstration. They are the evidence that intergenerational responsibility is not just an idea but something that human beings have actually practiced, in this specific land, for a very long time. That is a different kind of precedent from the usual ones invoked in discussions of sustainability. It is a precedent that comes from the land itself, from the people who knew the land most intimately, from the record that those people left in the most durable form available to them. We are the inheritors of that precedent, whether we know it or not, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. The land we are in is the same land where those stones were placed, and the sky above it is the same sky to which they are oriented, and the questions they were placed to help answer are still the questions that most need answering. Where are we? How do we live here well? What do we leave for the people who come after us? The stones are still asking, and the night is deep enough now that you can hear them. There is a geologist named Marion Tuck who spent 3 summers, between 2011 and 2013, in the Torngat Mountains of northern Labrador, mapping rock formations in one of the most isolated landscapes in North America. The Torngat Mountains are the northernmost range in eastern North America, a spine of ancient rock rising to over 1,600 meters above sea level along the Labrador-Quebec border, dropping into fjords that reach the Labrador Sea. The Inuit have lived in and around the Torngat for thousands of years. It is now a national park, one of the newest in Canada and one of the most remote. Tuck was not looking for archaeological sites. She was doing bedrock mapping, the slow, careful work of characterizing the geological formations of an area that had not been comprehensively surveyed. She had a team of 4, a research assistant and 2 field technicians, and they moved through the mountains in a way that required constant attention to footing and weather and the position of the sun. The Torngat in summer is beautiful with a severity that commands attention. The mountains are dark-coloured, almost purple in certain lights, and the valleys between them are sometimes filled with glacial ice that has persisted from the last ice age into the present, remnant glaciers getting smaller every year. In the second summer, in July of 2012, Tuck found herself on a south-facing slope above a fjord, in an area where the bedrock was unusually flat and where a previous glaciation had left a polished surface on which her geological mapping work was unusually straightforward. She was working methodically, recording lithological units and structural orientations, moving in a systematic pattern across the polished surface. Near the southern edge of the polished area, she stopped. The polished surface had markings on it, not geological markings, not striations from the glacier, which she had been observing all morning, not frost weathering or wind erosion, Markings that had been made by something harder than the rock surface itself, applied in a deliberate pattern. Circles, mostly. Some of them single circles, some of them multiple concentric rings. And here and there, between and around the circles, lines that connected them in ways that suggested a spatial logic, a map-like quality. Tuck photographed the surface. She spent the rest of that day photographing it from multiple angles and in multiple lighting conditions. She measured the dimensions of the markings. She noted their distribution across the polished surface. She went back to her camp and wrote a careful description in her field journal. And then she did something that distinguishes a good scientist from an incurious one. She did not assign the markings to a known category and move on. She wrote, in her field journal, "I do not know what these are. They require expertise I do not have. Someone who does needs to see them." She sent photographs to a colleague in the archaeology department at Memorial University. The colleague, a specialist in Arctic prehistory named James Agnatok, had seen petroglyphs in the Torngat region before, rock carvings associated with the Dorset and Thule cultures that had inhabited the region before and during and after the Norse contact period. He looked at Tuck's photographs and said that these were unlike anything he had seen in the Torngat context. The cup and ring style was familiar to him from the literature on European Neolithic petroglyphs, but not from the Arctic or subarctic archaeology of North America. He visited the site the following summer with Tuck. He agreed in person with what he had said on seeing the photographs. The markings were anomalous. They did not fit the known Dorset or Thule stylistic repertoire. They were on a surface that the geological context, the degree of weathering of the markings relative to the glacially polished surface, suggested had been exposed for many thousands of years. And they bore a formal resemblance to a tradition of rock marking that is associated, in the scholarly literature, with the Atlantic fringe of Europe in the Neolithic period. Agnatok and Tuck wrote a joint report. They submitted it to Parks Canada and to the Nunatsiavut government, the Inuit government of Labrador that has jurisdiction over lands in the region. The Nunatsiavut government received the report with interest. They noted that Inuit oral traditions from the Torngat region included references to markings on rocks that were made by people who had come before. Not the Thule people, who were the direct ancestors of the modern Labrador Inuit, before even the Thule, before the Dorset, who were themselves old beyond reckoning in the oral traditions, markings made by people who had been there first when the world was different. Markings made by people who had been there first. The Torngat petroglyphs, if that is what they are sitting in a landscape that the Inuit have inhabited long enough to have traditions about what came before them, traditions that point further back than the known archaeological record currently goes. And they bear a resemblance to a marking tradition from the other side of the Atlantic that researchers have been documenting for over a century. And they are anomalous within the established framework of North American prehistoric rock art. Anomalous. That word again, the same word that Harold Doreen used in 1971 about the 11 stones on the Temagami Ridge. The word that honest observers use when they encounter something real that they cannot yet explain. Anomalous. Not impossible, not fraudulent, not to be dismissed, but not fitting. Not sitting comfortably within the categories available. Requiring more thought. Requiring more data. Requiring the willingness to sit with the discomfort of not knowing and to continue looking rather than forcing a premature resolution. The anomalies are accumulating. Across the country, from the Torngat to Haida Gwaii, from the Gaspé to the Gatineau Hills, from the Alberta prairies to the Ontario Shield, anomalies are accumulating. Each one individually might be explainable within the existing framework, but collectively, they are pressing on the framework in a way that is increasingly difficult to ignore. The framework has to expand to accommodate them, or it has to break, and frameworks prefer to expand rather than break, if the evidence allows. The evidence is allowing. Slowly, imperfectly, amid all the institutional resistance and the funding shortfalls and the unanswered appendices in misfiled folders, the evidence is allowing the framework to expand. The story of pre-contact North America is getting bigger. It is getting older. It is getting more complex and more rich and more human. It is getting closer to the story that Indigenous knowledge holders have been telling all along, the story of a land that was inhabited with intelligence and care for a very long time by people who knew what they were doing. The megaliths are part of this expansion. They are evidence that requires the framework to expand. They are evidence of a tradition of organized, sophisticated, intellectually serious engagement with landscape and cosmos that goes back further than the official story has acknowledged. and that spans a continent in ways that the official story has not yet found a way to map. Mapping it is the work of the coming decades. The work of the researchers who are doing it now, patiently, and often without adequate resources, will eventually be synthesized into a picture that changes what we teach in schools and what we include in documentaries and what we say when someone asks what the history of Canada actually is. That synthesis is not here yet, but the pieces of it are being assembled. In the field journals and the statistical databases and the collaborative conversations between knowledge holders and researchers, and in the slowly changing policies of institutions that are beginning to take this history seriously, the picture that will emerge from that synthesis will not be a simple one. It will not resolve into a clean narrative with a beginning and a middle and a satisfying end. It will be a picture of complexity and continuity and interruption, of knowledge built over millennia and disrupted by colonization and partially preserved and partially lost and now partially recovering. It will be a picture that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who is attached to the simplified version of Canadian history. And it will be a picture that is deeply vindicating for the communities that have been saying, for as long as anyone has been listening, that the land has a deeper story than the official account has ever acknowledged. That deeper story is what these stones are carrying across the centuries, across the disruptions, across the institutional indifference and the misfiled reports and the decommissioned satellite imagery that no one followed up on, carrying it with the patience of stone, which is not a quality of personality but a quality of material. Stone does not choose to be patient, it simply continues, it endures, and in enduring, it carries what was put into it. What was put into the Canadian megaliths was knowledge and intention and care, the knowledge of the sky and the land, the intention to preserve that knowledge for people not yet born, the care of communities that understood their responsibility to the future. These are not small things. They are exactly the things that a culture at the edge of environmental and social catastrophe most needs to recover. The knowledge of how to inhabit a landscape wisely, the intention to preserve what matters for those who come after, the care that looks past the immediate and thinks about the long chain. The stones are teaching these things, not in words, in their presence, in their alignment to truths that do not change, in their endurance, in the fact that they are still there, still speaking, still aligned to the sky that the people who placed them were also watching. We are watching the same sky. The same sun rises at the same point on the horizon on the same morning every year. The same stars wheel around the same pole. The same patterns that were worth encoding in granite are still there, still readable, still true. The universe has not changed its patterns to inconvenience the people who encoded them in stone thousands of years ago. The patterns are stable, the knowledge is still valid, and so the invitation stands. The one that has been standing since the first stone was placed on the first ridge by the first person who stopped and thought, the people who come after need to know this. The people who come after need to know where they are and what time it is, in the large sense of time, and how to read the sky, and how to find the water, and how to live in this particular landscape without depleting it. The people who come after are us. We are the people who come after, in this particular link in the chain. And the stones are still speaking, and the knowledge, what remains of it, is still available to anyone willing to go to the ridge and look. You do not have to go to the ridge tonight. Tonight the ridge is far away and the room is dark and the slow waves of sleep are probably almost here. Let them come. Let the story settle in you the way stone settles into permafrost. Gradually, without urgency, but deeply. Let the questions rest in you, not demanding answers tonight, not requiring resolution, just resting. The questions will be there in the morning. The stones will be there in the morning. The sky above them, still arranged in the patterns that have not changed, will be there in the morning. The only thing that changes is the willingness to look. And that willingness, which is what the builders of the stones were counting on when they placed them, is something you can choose. Any morning, any ridge, any cold clear moment when the sun rises at the angle that was anticipated, that was encoded in granite, that was left for you to see when you were ready. It will be there when you are ready. For now, sleep. Let the dark of this particular night deepen around you. Let the stone weight of 10,000 years settle gently into the edges of your dreaming. Let the stars wheel overhead in their ancient courses above the land that has been marked by human hands and human knowing for longer than most of us have imagined possible. Let the wind move across the ridges where the stones stand in their patient lines. Let the shadows shorten and lengthen with the seasons as they have shortened and lengthened since the stones were placed. The world is older than we thought, more inhabited, more intelligent, more patient, more worth understanding. And the understanding is slowly, genuinely coming. One anomalous field note at a time. One misfiled appendix found by a curious graduate student. One retired teacher walking the forests of the Gaspé for 6 years and writing down everything he sees. One engineer building a database of 300 sites over 20 years because her grandmother told her about a place where old stones stand in a line and the sunset does something extraordinary. The understanding is coming, and the stones are waiting, and now your eyes are probably closed, and the words are probably dissolving into something softer than meaning, into the sound of a voice in the dark, into the rhythm of language without the weight of the individual words. That is exactly right. That is the right way to receive a story this large. Not by grasping it, but by letting it move through you. Not by understanding every piece of it, but by carrying the shape of it, the general sense of depth and age and seriousness and patience. Carry the shape into sleep. Carry the image of 11 stones on a ridge, spaced at intervals that are too precise to be accidental, facing north in a line. Carry the image of a shadow falling on a cut mark at the moment of summer solstice sunrise, exactly as designed, exactly as it has fallen. Every summer solstice for however many thousands of years, since someone pecked that cup into granite and aligned that boulder to cast that shadow. Carry the image of someone, unimaginably far back in time, standing on a headland in Haida Gwaii and looking out at the Pacific horizon and deciding that the knowledge gained by that looking was worth carving into stone. They were right. Whatever they knew, it was worth carving into stone. Not because stone is the best medium we have now, but because what they were expressing, the quality of attention, the respect for knowledge, the care for those who come after, those are the things that any medium worth using should express. This video is its own kind of medium. It will not last as long as stone. Nothing we make now will last as long as stone, unless we deliberately put things in orbit, or in geological repositories, or in some other form that is outside the normal cycles of decay. But for the purposes of this particular night, for this particular listener, in this particular room, in whatever city or town or rural quiet they happen to inhabit, it is a medium for carrying something forward, for carrying the shape of a story, for carrying the sense of a land that is older and richer than the official story has acknowledged, inhabited and marked and known by people who are not less than us in any way that matters, doing what human beings do when they are paying proper attention to the world they are in. The story belongs to you now. Whatever part of it found a home in you tonight, whatever image or feeling or question arrived in you while the words moved through, that belongs to you. You can do with it what you like. Take it to the ridge, if you want. Read more. Ask the knowledge holders. Follow the citations in the academic papers and trace the evidence back to its sources. Or simply carry it, without doing anything in particular with it, as a kind of ballast, a sense that there is more here than meets the eye, that the land has stories, that the stones are speaking, that the people who have always known this deserve to be heard. Whatever you carry it gently, the way the stones carry what was put into them, with endurance, with patience, without drama, the way things that last a long time tend to carry what they carry. Good night. The stones are still standing. The sky is unchanged above them. And the story, which is longer than this video and older than anything we have talked about tonight, is still going. There is one more thing to say before this particular telling ends. One more thread to pull on, gently, in the way you pull on threads when the fabric is delicate and you do not want to damage it. The thread is this. The story we have told tonight is not a finished story. It does not have the clean resolution that finished stories have. The questions it raises are not answered. The anomalies it documents are not explained. The relationship between the Canadian megaliths and the megalithic traditions of the Old World remains unresolved. The dates of the oldest sites remain uncertain within ranges that span thousands of years. The oral traditions that speak of peoples who came before remain partially illegible to the academic frameworks that would most benefit from taking them seriously. The databases sit in retired engineers' computers, the reports sit in provincial heritage offices, the sites sit on ridges and headlands, in various states of documentation and protection, waiting. That incompleteness is not a failure. It is the current state of an ongoing process. Science and history and the recovery of suppressed knowledge do not proceed to clean endings. They proceed through accumulation and revision and the slow, grinding work of bringing evidence and interpretation into contact with each other until something that looks like understanding emerges. The understanding that has emerged so far from the work of all the people we have talked about tonight and the many more we have not, is significant. It is genuinely, substantively different from the understanding that existed 30 years ago. The story of pre-contact Canada has expanded. It is still expanding. The expansion will continue. The tools for it are getting better. The collaborative relationships that make the best work possible are developing. The institutional will, while still far from adequate, is growing. The public appetite for the true story, for the complicated version that renders Canada as a place with a deep human history, is real and is being expressed in ways that institutions are beginning to notice. The stones will be there for all of it. They have been there through everything already. They will be there for the next chapter of the story. When the radiocarbon dates come back from the Haida Gwaii excavation, and when Brenda Lariviere finally publishes her statistical analysis, and when the Nunatsiavut government and James Agnatok and Marion Tuck figure out how to proceed with the Torngat petroglyphs, and when the underwater survey of the Great Lakes anomalies finally gets funded, and when whoever finds the next appendix in the next misfiled folder follows it to the next ridge, they will be there, patient, aligned, speaking in the only language they know. You have been listening to a very long story tonight. Or perhaps you have been half asleep through much of it, which is entirely the right way to receive a story this old. The mind that is almost asleep is open in ways that the fully alert mind sometimes is not. It receives things that the alert mind filters out. It lets things in that the alert mind, with its need to evaluate and categorize and decide, might close itself to. Let it in. Let the shape of this story, the shape of a land that is older than we thought and more inhabited and more intelligent, let it in. Not as a conclusion, not as something you need to believe or argue for or defend, just as a shape, a general sense of depth. A reminder that the ground you stand on has a history that goes back much further than the story you were taught, and that the people who know that history, who have maintained it through everything that was done to erase it, deserve to be heard. That is the whole thing, really. That is what the stones have been trying to say. From the ridge northeast of Lady Evelyn Lake, from the Gaspé Peninsula, from the headland at Haida Gwaii, from the prairies of Saskatchewan, from the polished rock face in the Torngat Mountains, from the bottom of Lake Michigan, we were here. We knew things. The land has a history. Listen, you have been listening, and that is everything. That is exactly what was asked of you, and it is enough. Sleep now. The stones will be standing in the morning. One final image to carry with you into the dark. Somewhere in northern Ontario, on a ridge that no highway passes near, 11 stones stand in a line. They are granite, local granite, nothing exotic. Their faces are flattened in a way that weathering alone does not produce. They are spaced at intervals of 1.7 meters. They have been standing there for however many thousands of years they have been standing there, and they will be standing there tomorrow and next year and in 100 years and in 1,000 years, unless something very large and very unlikely happens to move them. The wind moves through them tonight. The boreal forest below the ridge is full of the small sounds of a northern wilderness at night. The distant calling of a loon, the movement of something small in the undergrowth, the very particular silence that is not absence of sound, but the presence of a vast and inhabited quiet. The aurora, if it is an aurora night, is moving above the ridge in its curtains of green and white, and the stones stand in all of it, patient in the way that only the very old and the very still are patient, carrying what was put into them, speaking in their alignment, their orientation, their precise and deliberate spacing, the language of where and when and what direction and what angle of the light. The language is old, the stones are old. The sky they are aligned to is older than any of us. And somewhere in the overlap between the human intention that placed the stones and the astronomical reality to which they are oriented, something true is being said. You have heard some of it tonight. The part of it that language can carry, which is less than the full thing but not nothing. Let the rest come in dreams, in the body's own knowledge, in whatever way deep time enters a sleeping mind and leaves something changed when you wake. The stones are still speaking. The story is still going, and you can rest. The night has been long enough. The story has been long enough. And the land outside, wherever you are, is doing what it always does when no one is watching, continuing its ancient rhythms without reference to the stories we tell about it. The sun moving through its arc below the horizon toward tomorrow morning, the wind moving through the trees, the water moving through the rock toward the cold springs that have been feeding the cold lakes since the glaciers melted, the stones standing on their ridges in whatever light the night provides, oriented to truths that have not changed since they were placed. That constancy is what you take with you, into sleep, into tomorrow.